Before we begin, a quick and heartfelt thank you to Shane for suggesting this one. This entire story exists tonight because you took a moment to share the idea, and I am grateful for it. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we're travelling far from the warmth of your bed, out past the blue edge of our atmosphere, past the silver face of our own moon, across the long cold dark of space to a small red world and the strange lump of rock that circles it. This is a story about that rock. It is a story about the men and women who studied it, the questions they were afraid to ask out loud, and the answer they may have found waiting in the silence. Everything you are about to hear is a work of fiction, a conspiracy thriller woven around real history. The Soviet Phobos missions were real. The scientists you will hear about are invented, but the events that inspired them actually happened. The official explanation, the one printed in every textbook, is that these missions failed because of ordinary technical problems. Keep that in mind as we go. Hold it gently, the way you would hold a candle in a dark room. Because sometimes the official explanation is the whole truth, and sometimes it is only the part of the truth we are allowed to see. Close your eyes now. Let me tell you about the silent moon. There is a moon that should not exist. It circles the planet Mars, closer to its world than any other moon in the entire solar system circles its own. It moves so fast that it rises in the west and sets in the east, crossing the Martian sky twice in a single day. It is shaped wrong, lumpen and pitted, like a potato carved by a careless hand, and it is far too light for a rock of its size, as though something inside it were missing, as though it were hollow. Its name is Phobos. In the old Greek myths, Phobos was the personification of fear itself, the son of the god of war riding beside his father into battle. When the astronomer who discovered it chose that name, he could not have known how fitting it would one day seem. He simply thought it suited a moon of Mars, the red planet, the planet named for war. But names have a strange way of becoming true, and the fear that would one day gather around this small dark moon was very real to the handful of people who studied it most closely. This is their story, and it begins, as so many strange stories do, in a locked room in Moscow, in the final trembling years of an empire that did not know it was already dying. Moscow, in the winter of 1983. The snow came down over the city in slow, heavy curtains, softening the hard edges of the concrete towers, muffling the sound of traffic, settling on the shoulders of the men who hurried along the frozen streets with their collars turned up against the cold. It was the kind of cold that got into your bones and stayed there, the kind that made the whole world feel smaller and greyer and more watchful. Inside a plain building near the edge of the city, in a room without windows, a young man sat waiting. His name was Viktor Leonov. He was 31 years old, thin, with dark, restless eyes, and hands that never quite stopped moving. He was an astrophysicist, one of the brightest of his generation, and he had been summoned here to this quiet building for reasons that had not been explained to him. He had been told only to come, to tell no one, and to wait. So he waited. The room held a single table and 2 chairs. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling. On the wall, someone had pinned a photograph of the night sky, a long exposure showing the stars smeared into thin, bright arcs by the turning of the earth. Victor stared at it and thought about how far away those stars were, how the light striking his eyes had left them thousands of years ago, how he was looking not at the present, but at the deep and ancient past. It was a thought that had comforted him since he was a boy. The universe was so vast that human troubles seemed to shrink beside it. Empires rose and fell in the time it took a single beam of starlight to cross a single corner of a single galaxy. The door opened. An older man entered, carrying a thin folder under his arm. He was perhaps 60, with a grey beard neatly trimmed and eyes that had the tired kindness of a man who had seen a great deal and forgotten none of it. He sat down across from Victor without offering his name. He set the folder on the table but did not open it. You know who Josef Shklovsky was, the older man said. It was not a question. Victor felt his heart quicken. Of course he knew. Every young Soviet astronomer knew. Shklovsky was a legend, one of the great minds of Soviet science, a man who had studied everything from the sun's corona to the possibility of life among the stars. He had written books that Victor had read by flashlight as a boy, hidden under his blanket long after he should have been asleep. Everyone knows Shklovsky, Victor said carefully. The older man nodded slowly. And do you know what he said about the moons of Mars? Victor hesitated. Here they were entering deeper water. In the late 1950s, Shklovsky had made a suggestion so strange, so provocative, that it had followed him for the rest of his career. He had noticed that Phobos, the inner moon of Mars, appeared to be slowly spiralling inward toward its planet. From the rate of that spiral, he had tried to calculate the moon's density, and the number he arrived at was troubling. The moon seemed far too light for a solid body of its size. Shklovsky had offered an explanation, one he himself half admitted was more provocation than serious theory. What if Phobos was not solid at all? What if it was hollow? And what could make a moon hollow? A thin shell of metal wrapped around empty space. Only one thing that anyone could imagine. Something built. He suggested it might be artificial, Victor said quietly. A hollow shell. He walked it back later. He said the measurements were uncertain. He said he had been speculating, nothing more. Yes, said the older man. He walked it back. That is what a wise man does when he has said something dangerous and wishes to keep his position, his funding and his freedom. He paused. But saying a thing is not the same as unsaying it. Once a question has been asked, it cannot truly be unasked. It only goes quiet. It waits. He slid the folder across the table. Some of us never stopped asking, he said. And now we would like you to help us find the answer. Victor opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Grainy, black and white, blown up from long-range observations. They showed a small, irregular body against the darkness of space, its surface covered in craters and long parallel grooves that ran across it like the marks of enormous fingernails. He had seen images of Phobos before, in journals and textbooks. But these were different. These were annotated, marked with careful handwriting, measurements and arrows and question marks, and beneath the photographs, a single typed page, a summary, a list of things about this moon that did not make sense. Victor read it slowly, and as he read, the small windowless room seemed to grow colder still. The list was short, but every item on it was a small wrongness, a place where the universe failed to behave the way a rock should behave. The density was too low. Measured again and again over decades, the mass of Phobos simply did not match its size. Either it was made of something impossibly light, or a great portion of its interior was empty space. The grooves were strange. Long parallel channels ran across the surface, hundreds of them, all roughly aligned. Geologists had offered explanations. Rolling boulders, stress fractures, the scars of some ancient impact. But none of the explanations quite fit all the grooves at once, and some of them seemed almost too regular, too evenly spaced, too much like the work of a pattern rather than an accident. There were thermal readings that did not match. In certain observations, parts of the moon appeared to release heat in ways that a cold dead rock drifting through the frozen dark should not have been able to produce. And the orbit itself was subtly, stubbornly odd. Small variations that no one had fully explained. None of these things on its own meant anything. Every one of them could have an ordinary answer. Rocks are strange. Space is strange. The universe is full of things we do not yet understand, and most of them turn out in the end to be perfectly natural. But here they all were, gathered on one page, and gathered together, they formed a shape that made the back of Victor's neck prickle. At the top of the page, someone had typed a title. Just 2 words, Object 7. Victor looked up. Why 7? The older man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You will learn, he said, that some questions are answered only to those who have earned the answer. For now, it is enough to know that this object has been watched for a very long time, longer than you have been alive, and that a small number of serious people whose judgment I trust more than my own, have come to believe that it is not what it appears to be. He leaned forward. "We're going to Mars," he said. "The program is already approved. 2 spacecraft. The world will be told we're going to study the red planet and photograph its little moon. That is true. We will do those things." He tapped the folder. "But there is another purpose, known to only a few, and you, Victor Leonov, are going to be one of the few." Victor said nothing. The bare bulb hummed softly above them. Outside, beyond the walls of this room, the snow went on falling over Moscow, over the vast frozen country, over a world that had no idea that in a locked room a young man had just been handed a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "What is the purpose?" Victor asked at last. The older man gathered the photographs one by one and returned them to the folder. He closed it. He stood. "We're going to find out," he said, "whether the moon is hollow, and if it is hollow, we're going to find out what is inside." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "Sleep well tonight, Victor," he said. "It may be some time before you sleep easily again." And then he was gone, and Victor was alone with the humming bulb and the smeared stars on the wall, and a cold that no coat could keep out. Let your breathing slow now. Let the story carry you the way a slow river carries a leaf. There is no hurry. We have a long way to travel, and all the time in the world. The classified group met in ordinary places. That was the first thing Victor learned about the work. There were no secret bunkers, no gleaming underground laboratories like the ones in Western films. The most secret work in the Soviet Union was done in the most ordinary rooms. A cramped office at the Institute for Space Research, a borrowed lecture hall after the students had gone home, sometimes a kitchen table in a shared apartment, with the radio turned up loud to defeat any listening device that might be hidden in the walls. The group was small. Victor was never given the full list of names, and he came to understand that this was deliberate. What you did not know, you could not confess. What you had never been told, you could not betray. Each member of the group knew a few of the others and could only guess at the rest. It was a web with no centre that anyone could see, and Victor was one small thread in it. But over the months, he came to know several of them well. There was Grigory, an engineer with enormous hands and a soft voice, who could coax a signal out of the most stubborn instrument, and who kept a photograph of his 2 young daughters taped inside the lid of his toolbox. There was Anya, a mathematician a few years older than Victor, sharp and impatient and brilliant, who could look at a page of telemetry and see patterns in it the way other people saw faces in the clouds. And there was the old man, the one who had first brought Victor into the room, whose name Victor eventually learned was Pavel Antonovich, and who served as the quiet conscience of the whole enterprise. They worked, they argued, they filled notebooks with calculations, and slowly, over the long grey months, the shape of the mission came into focus. The public programme was called Phobos. 2 spacecraft, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2, would be launched toward Mars. Officially, they would study the Sun and interplanetary space along the way, and upon arrival they would photograph the red planet and approach its inner moon, mapping its surface and even, if all went well, firing instruments at it to sample the material of its skin. It was an ambitious mission, one of the most ambitious the Soviet space program had ever attempted. The whole world would be watching. But aboard Phobos 2, and among the ordinary scientific instruments, there would be a few others, instruments that would not appear on the public list, instruments designed to answer only one question: deep penetration radar to see through the surface of the moon and map whatever lay beneath. Gravimetric scanners to measure the pull of the moon's gravity with such precision that the distribution of its hidden mass could be calculated, revealing where the moon was solid and where it was empty. Subsurface imaging equipment to build a picture of the interior of a body that no human eye had ever seen inside. 12 people knew the true purpose of these instruments. Victor was one of them. 12! Anya said one evening when the two of them were alone in the office, surrounded by cold cups of tea and the blue light of a monitor. You know what that number does to me? 12 people who know, and hundreds who do not. Every day we sit in meetings and nod and say nothing while the others plan their little experiments. It is like being at a funeral where only you know the man in the coffin is still breathing. Victor almost laughed. That is a grim way to put it. I am a grim person, Anya said. It comes from staring at numbers. Numbers do not lie to you. People lie all the time. She turned to the monitor where a column of figures glowed. But these numbers, Victor, these particular numbers about our little moon, I have checked them every way I know how, and every way I check them, they tell me the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. That moon is too light. There is empty space inside it, a great deal of empty space. Caves, Victor said. Natural cavities. It happens. Perhaps. She did not sound convinced. Or perhaps something scooped it out. Or perhaps, and here she lowered her voice, though there was no one to hear, perhaps it was never filled in to begin with. Perhaps it was built the way a house is built, with rooms and corridors and empty spaces meant to be empty. She shook her head. I do not believe it. I want you to understand that. As a rational person, I do not believe it. But the numbers do not care what I believe. The debates were fierce. Even within the secret group, even among the 12, there was no agreement about what Phobos really was. The arguments went around and around, in offices and kitchens and quiet corners, in whispers and in raised voices quickly hushed. Most of the group believed Phobos was a captured asteroid. This was the ordinary explanation, the sensible one. Long ago, they said, a chunk of rock wandering through the solar system had drifted too close to Mars and been snared by its gravity, pulled into orbit, doomed to circle the red planet until, millions of years from now, it would spiral inward and be torn apart or crash into the surface. The low density could be explained by a loose interior, a rubble pile of rock and ice and dust held together by nothing but its own faint gravity, full of gaps and voids. The grooves could be scars from the impact that had once nearly shattered it. Everything strange about the moon, they insisted, had an ordinary answer, if only you were willing to look for it. A smaller number were not so sure. They pointed to the sum of the anomalies, the way each strange fact stacked upon the last. A loose rubble pile, they argued, would not hold such regular grooves. A captured asteroid would not so neatly explain the thermal readings. And a rubble pile, drifting for eons, should have been ground down and reshaped by the countless small impacts of space. Yet Phobos held its strange lumpen form as though something inside it gave it structure. And then there was Pavel Antonovich, who mostly listened. One night, when the argument had gone on for hours and everyone was tired and short-tempered, the old man finally spoke. He had been sitting in the corner, a glass of tea cooling untouched in his hands, listening to the younger scientists throw their theories back and forth like players in a game. Now he set down his glass, and the small sound of it against the table silenced the room. "You're all asking the wrong question," he said. They waited. "You argue about whether it is a rock or something more. This is interesting, but it is not the important question." He looked at each of them in turn. "The important question is this. Suppose it is artificial. Suppose, just for the sake of the argument, that Josef Shklovsky was right all those years ago, and that little moon out there is not a moon at all but a made thing, a shell of metal wrapped around empty rooms." He paused. "If someone built it, then it had a purpose. Nothing is built without a purpose. A house is built to be lived in. A wall is built to keep something out, or to keep something in. A watchtower is built to watch." The room was very still. "So if it is artificial," Pavel Antonovich said softly, "I do not ask myself who built it. That question I cannot answer, and it does not frighten me. I ask myself instead a simpler question, a question I can almost bear to think about." "What question?" Anya asked. The old man smiled, and it was the saddest smile Victor had ever seen. What was it built to do? He said. And is it still doing it? No one spoke after that. One by one they gathered their coats and went out into the cold, and each of them, walking home alone through the snow, found that they were glancing up at the sky more often than usual, at the small cold points of the stars, and thinking about a made thing wrapped in rock, circling a red planet millions of miles away, patient as a stone. Let that thought settle over you now, softly, the way the snow settled over Moscow. There is nothing to fear in your warm, dark room. The moon is very far away, and this is only a story, and you are safe and drowsy and held. Let us go on. The years passed the way years do, quickly in memory and slowly in the living. 1984 became 1985. 1985 became 1986. The country changed around them. A new leader came to power, younger than the old men who had ruled before, and he spoke of openness and reform, of a new honesty between the government and its people. Some in the group hoped this new openness might one day reach even their secret work, might let the truth of Phobos, whatever that truth turned out to be, come at last into the light. Others were more cautious. Openness, they said, was a word politicians used. It did not mean what it seemed to mean, and the deepest secrets, the ones about objects in the sky that should not exist, those secrets would be the last of all to be released, if they were ever released at all. Victor worked through all of it. He grew older. His hairline crept back a little. He married a schoolteacher named Katya, a warm, bright woman who knew only that her husband worked on the space program and never asked more than he could tell her. He learned, as everyone in that world learned, to live two lives. In one life he was an ordinary man who loved his wife and drank tea with his neighbours and complained about the weather. In the other life he was one of 12 people who carried a secret that could crack the foundations of everything the world believed about itself. And through it all, the spacecraft took shape. He visited the assembly facility once in the last year before launch. He remembered walking into an enormous hall, clean and bright, where the two probes stood side by side, wrapped in gold foil that caught the light like something out of a fairy tale. Technicians moved around them in white coats and caps, their voices low and reverent, and Victor stood at the edge of the hall and felt something catch in his throat. They were beautiful. That was the thing no one told you about these machines. In photographs they looked like cold assemblies of metal and wire. But standing before them, seeing the care that had gone into every joint and panel, feeling the weight of the human hope packed into them, Victor understood that they were beautiful. They were letters in a way. Letters written by a whole civilization and addressed to the unknown. Letters that would travel farther than any human being had ever travelled, out across the dark, to knock politely on a door that had been closed for longer than there had been human beings to knock on it. He put his hand against the cool metal of the assembly rail and made a silent wish. Not for glory, not for discovery, just that the machines would fly true, that they would reach their distant destination, that whatever was out there, whatever waited in the dark around the red planet, would let them look and let them come home. He did not know, standing there, how many of those wishes would go unanswered. Launch day came in the summer of 1988. The launches were set for the great cosmodrome out on the flat, endless steppe, the same ground from which the first satellite and the first human being had risen into space decades before. The whole program had waited for this moment, for the narrow window when Mars and Earth swung close enough together in their orbits to make the long journey possible. Miss the window, and they would have to wait more than 2 years for it to open again. On the 7th of July, 1988, Phobos 1 left the Earth. Victor watched from the control centre, his heart in his throat as the rocket climbed on its pillar of fire, rolled onto its course, and shed its stages one by one until the spacecraft was free, coasting outward into the dark, its solar panels unfolding like the wings of some enormous golden insect. The room erupted in applause. Grigory pounded Victor on the back so hard he nearly fell over. Even Anya, who never smiled, was smiling. 5 days later, on the 12th of July, Phobos 2 followed its sister into the sky. 2 arrows loosed across the void, 2 letters on their way to the door. For a few weeks, everything was perfect. The spacecraft called home each day, their signals faint but clear, reporting all systems healthy as they fell away from the Earth and out toward the distant red spark of Mars. In the control centre, the mood was light. People made jokes. Someone brought in a cake. The long years of work seemed to be paying off at last. And then, in the late summer, the first disaster struck. It came, as disasters so often do, from something small. A routine command was sent up to Phobos 1, a set of instructions to adjust the spacecraft's systems. But somewhere in the long chain of that command, in the writing of it or the transmission of it, a single element was wrong, a single character out of place, and that tiny error told the spacecraft to do something it should never have done. It told it to switch off the system that kept its solar panels pointed at the sun. The panels drifted away from the light, the batteries drained, and out in the dark, millions of miles from any hand that could help it, Phobos 1 grew cold, and its power failed, and it fell silent. They tried everything. For days, the engineers sent command after command up into the void, calling to their lost machine, pleading with it to wake, to turn, to catch the sun again. But the spacecraft was already dead, tumbling slowly through the dark, its golden wings turned uselessly away from the light that might have saved it. It would coast on forever now, a beautiful frozen corpse, a letter that would never reach its door. The public was told, in the careful language of official statements, that a technical fault had ended the mission of Phobos 1. The newspapers ran the story on an inside page. The world shrugged. Space is hard, everyone knew. Missions fail. There was still the second spacecraft, still Phobos 2, healthy and true and streaking toward Mars. All hope was not lost. But in the small hidden circle of the 12, the mood was not disappointment. It was fear. They gathered that night quietly in the borrowed office. No cake now, no jokes. Anya stood at the window with her arms crossed, staring out at the lights of the city. Grigory sat with his enormous hands folded, his face grey. Pavel Antonovich was very still. "A command error," Anya said, not turning around. "A single character. After all these years, after everything we built, we lost half the mission to a typing mistake." She laughed, a short bitter sound. "Do you know how unlikely that is? The command software was checked and checked again. I checked it myself." "Machines fail," Grigory said quietly. "People make mistakes. It is nobody's fault." "Perhaps," Anya turned from the window. Her face in the dim light was hard to read. "Or perhaps I am tired and frightened and seeing shadows where there are none. But I will tell you what I keep thinking, and then I will never say it again, because if I keep saying it, I will lose my mind." She took a breath. "We are sending 2 machines to knock on a very old door. One of them is now dead, and it died of an error that should not have happened, at the worst possible moment, just as it began the long fall toward the thing we most wanted to see." No one answered her. "We have 1 chance left," she said. "Just 1. And I find that I am no longer sure I want it to succeed." Pavel Antonovich looked up at that. "Why not?" Anya met his eyes. "Because I keep hearing your voice, old man," she said, "asking your question. What was it built to do, and is it still doing it?" She shivered, though the room was not cold. What if it is doing it right now? What if it noticed us the moment we left the Earth? What if the first machine did not fail at all, but was simply told very gently to go to sleep as a warning? Turn back, come no closer, and now we're sending the second one straight toward it, ignoring the warning like fools walking up to a sleeping animal and poking it with a stick to see if it will wake. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Pavel Antonovich rose slowly and crossed to where Anya stood and put one old hand on her shoulder. "You may be right," he said gently. "You may be wrong. We do not know, and that is the whole trouble. We have spent our lives learning that the universe is knowable, that every question has an answer if only we are patient and clever enough to find it. And now we approach a thing that may not want to be known. That is a hard place for people like us to stand. He squeezed her shoulder. But we cannot stop now. The window is open, the machine is flying. We will see what there is to see, and then, whatever it is, we will have to be brave enough to look at it. Anya put her own hand over his just for a moment. Then she nodded, and the meeting broke up, and once again they went out one by one into the cold, and once again they looked up at the sky as they walked home. Only now the sky did not seem quite so empty. Now it seemed, to each of them, that something up there might be looking back. Rest a while here. Let your thoughts go soft and slow. The second machine flies on through the dark, and there is nothing to do now but wait and drift and let the miles unspool behind it. You are warm. You are safe. Let us follow it out to Mars. The journey took months. Through the autumn of 1988 and into the winter, Phobos 2 fell across the gulf between the worlds, growing colder and more distant with every passing day. The red planet, which had been only a bright point among the stars, slowly grew before the spacecraft's instruments into a disk, then a globe, a rust-coloured world streaked with pale dust storms and crowned with white caps of frozen air. And there, circling it, a tiny dark speck. The moon. Their moon. Object 7. In the control centre, the tension grew with each passing week. The team that gathered around the incoming data was larger now, made up of the public scientists and the secret 12 all mingled together, and Victor found the double life harder to maintain than ever. He would sit at his station studying the ordinary readings, the temperatures and the pressures and the health of the spacecraft's systems, while all the time his mind was somewhere else entirely, out there in the dark, watching that small speck grow. At the end of January 1989, Phobos 2 slid into orbit around Mars. It was a triumph. Whatever else happened, the Soviet Union had placed a working spacecraft in orbit around the red planet, and for a little while the control centre allowed itself to celebrate. There were photographs of Mars, beautiful and strange, the great volcanoes and the vast canyon that could swallow whole mountain ranges. The public programme was a success. The letters had, half of them, reached the far country. But the secret work was only just beginning. For the true mission required the spacecraft to leave its safe orbit and approach the moon. To draw close, closer than any human machine had ever come to Phobos, and to fly alongside it, matching its motion, hanging beside it in the dark like a swimmer beside a whale, and then, in that close embrace, to turn on the hidden instruments, the deep radar, the gravity scanners, the subsurface imagers, to reach out with invisible fingers and feel inside the moon, and learn at last whether it was solid stone or hollow shell. The approach was planned with enormous care. It would take weeks, a slow, careful spiral inward, adjusting the orbit little by little, until at last the spacecraft rode alongside its target. Every manoeuvre was checked and rechecked. Anya especially went over the commands again and again, remembering how the first spacecraft had died. She would not lose this one to a misplaced character, not this one. And through those weeks of slow approach, the first real data began to come in. The gravity readings came first. As the spacecraft drew nearer, it could feel the pull of the moon more and more clearly, and from the exact pattern of that pull, the scientists could begin to map the distribution of mass inside. Anya ran the numbers herself, alone, late at night, and when Victor found her the next morning, she was sitting very still before her screen, her face pale, her hands folded in her lap as though she were afraid to touch anything. "It is hollow," she said without preamble. "Victor, it is hollow. Not a few small caves, not a loose pile of rubble. There are enormous empty spaces inside it. Vast ones. The mass is all wrong, all pushed toward the outer shell, as though the centre had been deliberately left empty." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright and frightened. "Rocks are not built like this. Nothing natural is built like this. The centre of a natural body is dense, packed tight by its own weight. This is the opposite. This is a shell. Victor stared at the numbers on her screen. He was not a mathematician like Anya, but he did not need to be. The shape of the result was plain enough. A hollow moon. A great empty vault of a thing circling the red planet, and no one on Earth knowing what lay inside it. "We need the radar," he said quietly. "We need to see." "Yes," Anya said. "God help us. We need to see." The radar came a few days later. The deep penetration radar worked by firing pulses of energy down into the moon and listening for the echoes that came back, echoes shaped by whatever the pulses passed through, denser here, emptier there. From those echoes, patient computers could build a picture of the interior, a shadow map of the hidden world beneath the surface. It was slow, painstaking work, and the images came together bit by bit, line by line, over hours and then days. Victor was in the control centre when the first clear images resolved. He remembered the moment for the rest of his life. He remembered the low hum of the machines, the smell of stale coffee, the particular quality of the light. He remembered Grigory leaning over the console, his enormous hands very still, and Anya beside him, and Pavel Antonovich behind them both, the old man's face carved with shadows. And he remembered the image itself, glowing on the screen. They had all imagined caves. Even the most fearful among them had imagined natural cavities, the kind of hollows you might find inside any loose and ancient body. Rough, irregular, shaped by chance. That was not what they saw. The voids inside Phobos were not rough. They were not irregular. They had straight walls. They met at clean angles. They repeated chamber after chamber, corridor after corridor, in patterns that extended for miles into the depths of the moon. It was as though someone had taken the plans of an enormous building, a building the size of a mountain, and buried it inside a shell of rock and set it adrift in space. For a long time, no one in the control centre spoke. Then Grigory, the engineer, the man of practical hands, said the only thing that could be said. He said it very softly, almost to himself, in a voice that shook. "Asteroids," he said, "do not look like this." And still no one answered him. Because there was no answer. Because the thing on the screen had swept away, in a single silent image, every ordinary explanation they had clung to. The captured asteroid, the rubble pile, the loose collection of rock and ice, all of it gone, dissolved, in the presence of those clean straight walls and repeating chambers that no natural force in the universe could have built. Anya was the first to move. She reached out slowly and touched the screen with one fingertip, tracing the outline of one of the vast internal spaces. "It is a room," she whispered. "Victor, it is a room. Someone made a room inside a moon. Breathe slowly now. Let the wonder of it wash over you without fear. This is only a story, and you're only listening, drifting towards sleep in your warm bed. But even in a story, there are moments that make the hair rise on your arms. Let this be one of them, and then let it go, and let us continue on into the strangest part of all." There was more. As the days passed and the spacecraft drew ever closer, the instruments returned more and more detail, and each new detail was stranger than the last. The thermal scanners found the heat. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, in one particular region of the moon, something was warm. Not warm the way sunlit rock is warm, heated on one side and frozen on the other. This warmth came from within. It came from below, a source of heat, buried deep in the interior of a body that should have been utterly cold. A dead thing drifting in the endless frozen dark for millions upon millions of years. And it changed. That was the detail that Victor could never afterward forget. The one that visited him in the small hours of the night for the rest of his life. The heat source was not steady. Over the hours and days of observation it rose and fell, brightened and dimmed, fluctuated in a slow rhythm that no one could explain. As though something down there were working. As though some ancient engine buried in the heart of the moon were turning over slowly in the dark. waking perhaps, from a sleep longer than the history of the human race. It could be geological, said one of the public scientists when the readings were shown, carefully to a wider group. Radioactive decay, tidal heating from the pull of Mars. There are natural explanations. There are always natural explanations, Anya said quietly, right up until there are not. But she did not push it. None of the 12 pushed it. They had learned by now to keep their most dangerous thoughts to themselves. In public, they nodded along with the careful natural explanations. In private, in the borrowed office late at night, they said what they really thought. It is generating energy, Anya said. Something inside that moon is generating energy, and it has been doing so, on and off, for who knows how long. We have found a hollow shell full of rooms, with an engine at its heart that is still warm. She pressed her palms against her eyes. Pavel Antonovich, you asked the question all those years ago. Is it still doing what it was built to do? I think we have our answer. I think it is. The old man said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The images continued to come day after day as the spacecraft closed the last of the distance and prepared for its final closest approach. And then, in the last week of March, 1989, one image arrived that would outlive all the others. One image that would escape somehow from the locked rooms and the classified files and travel out into the wide world and become, in time, one of the most argued-over photographs ever taken. It was a picture of the space between the spacecraft and the surface of Mars, and in that space, against the darkness, there was a shadow, a long, dark, narrow shape, elongated, thin, stretching across the frame like the silhouette of something enormous passing between the camera and the planet beyond. The official explanation, the one that would eventually be given to the public when this single image slipped out, was simple and reasonable. It was an artifact, they would say, a flaw in the camera, a trick of the imaging system, a smear, a glitch, nothing more. Cameras produce artifacts all the time. It was foolish to read meaning into a smudge of shadow on a distant photograph. Inside the control centre, no one believed it. They had seen the camera's artifacts. They knew what its flaws looked like. This was not a flaw. This was a shape, cast against the sky, with edges and proportions, a thing that had a form and a location and a presence. And it was near the moon. It was near Object 7. It is a shadow, Grigory said. But a shadow of what? There is nothing there to cast it. Nothing that should be there. He looked up from the screen, his grey face greyer still. Unless there is something there that we cannot see directly. Something that only shows itself as a shadow. Victor felt the cold that had first touched him in that windowless room in Moscow, all those years ago, return now and settle deep in his chest, where it would remain for the rest of his days. They had come to knock on the door, and now, at last, something on the other side of the door had begun to stir. Do not be afraid. Keep your breathing slow and even, in and out like the tide. This is a story, only a story, and you are safe in your bed. But let the strangeness of it carry you a little further, out to the very edge, to the last moments of the little machine that flew so far to see what it should perhaps have left alone. The final approach was set for the last days of March. Phobos 2 would draw as close to the moon as it had ever come, closer than any human machine had ever come to another world's moon, near enough to fire its instruments directly into the surface and to photograph the terrain in detail no human eye had ever seen. It was to be the climax of the entire mission, the moment years of work had been building toward. If all went well, the spacecraft would ride alongside Object 7, matching its motion, hanging in the void beside it, and it would look, at last, upon the thing itself. Everyone was there. Every member of the team, secret and public, alike crowded into the control centre in the small hours of the morning, watching the screens, waiting for the signal that would tell them the spacecraft had begun its final manoeuvre. The signal came. The spacecraft turned. It began the slow, careful ballet of drawing alongside its target. For a while, everything was perfect. The telemetry flowed in, steady and clean, reporting all systems healthy, the spacecraft alive and well, and doing exactly as it had been told. The first close images began to arrive, showing the surface of the moon in extraordinary detail, the craters and the grooves and the dark ancient dust. Victor leaned toward the screen, hardly breathing, and thought, "We're going to do it. We're going to see. After all these years, all this fear, we're going to look upon the thing itself and know it for what it is." And then the telemetry changed. It was subtle at first, a small fluctuation in one reading, then another. Then the numbers began to shift in ways that made no sense, systems reporting states they should not have been in, values sliding where they should have held steady. Grigory sat forward, his brow furrowed, his hands moving quickly over his console. "Something is wrong," he said. "The spacecraft is. I do not understand. It is as though something is interfering with it." "Fix it," someone said. "Send a correction." "I am trying." Grigory's hands flew. "The commands are going up, but the responses are. They are not right. It is not responding the way it should. It is as though something else is talking to it." The numbers on the screens tumbled faster now, cascading, systems failing one after another in a spreading wave. The orientation control faltered. The power readings dipped. The communication signal, which had been strong and clear, began to break up, to fill with noise, to fade. "We're losing it," Anya said. Her voice was very quiet and very calm, the calm of someone watching something terrible happen and knowing there is nothing to be done. "We're losing it. Just like the first one. Just like Phobos 1. "No," Grigory said. He was still trying, still sending command after desperate command up into the dark. "No, come on, stay with me. And then, in the last moments before the signal failed entirely, one final piece of data came down from the spacecraft. It was not an image. It was not a photograph. It was a line of diagnostic text, the kind of automatic message the spacecraft systems generated when they encountered something they had not been programmed to expect. It appeared on the main screen, glowing, and every eye in the control center fixed upon it, and the whole room went utterly, deathly silent. 3 words. Unknown object detected. And then the signal was gone. The telemetry flatlined. The screens went to noise, to static, to the endless empty hiss of a channel with nothing on the other end. Phobos 2 was silent. They tried, of course. For hours, for days, they sent their calls up into the dark, pleading with the lost machine to answer, to wake, to speak. But there was nothing. Only silence. The second letter had reached the door and knocked, and something had answered, and now the letter would never come home. In the control center, no one moved for a long time. The message still glowed on the screen. Unknown object detected. 3 words, sent by a dying machine in its final moments, from a place no human being had ever been, about a thing no human being had ever seen. Pavel Antonovich was the one who finally broke the silence. He rose from his chair, an old man suddenly looking very much older, and he walked slowly to the main screen, and he stood before it, reading those 3 words over and over. "It saw something," he said softly. In its last moment, it saw something. Something it had no name for. Something it was never taught to expect. He turned to face the room and his eyes were wet. "We asked our question. We built our machines and we flew them across the void to ask our question. What was it built to do, and is it still doing it?" He gestured at the dead screen, at the 3 glowing words. "And there is our answer, my friends. There is our answer. Whatever that moon was built to do, it is still doing it, and it does not wish to be disturbed. Let the silence hold you now, gently. There is nothing frightening here in your warm, dark room. The machine is very far away and very long ago, and this is only a story that will fade like a dream when morning comes. But stay with me a little longer, for the story is not over. What happened next, in the rooms of men rather than the rooms of the moon, is stranger still. They came within hours. Victor had expected it, in some part of his mind, and yet when it happened it still shocked him. Men in plain suits, quiet men with careful eyes, arriving at the Institute before the sun was even up, moving through the corridors with the unhurried certainty of people who have never in their lives been told no. They separated everyone. That was the first thing. The team, which had been a single grieving crowd staring at a dead screen, was broken apart, each person taken to a separate room, each person questioned alone. What did you see? What did you record? Who have you spoken to? What do you believe happened? And always, beneath every question, the same unspoken warning. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you remember. Victor sat across a table from one of the quiet men for what felt like hours. The man was polite. He was almost gentle. He offered Victor tea and cigarettes and spoke to him in a soft, reasonable voice, as one colleague to another. But his questions circled always around the same points: the final images, the last transmission, the message on the screen, and Victor understood that this gentle, reasonable man was measuring him, weighing him, deciding how much of a problem he was going to be. The mission failed, the man said at last, setting down his tea. That is the finding, a technical failure, the same kind that claimed the first spacecraft. These things happen. Space is difficult. Machines break. He looked at Victor steadily. That is what happened. Do you understand me? That is what happened. And Victor, who had spent his whole adult life learning to live two lives, who knew exactly what was being asked of him and exactly what would happen if he refused, looked back at the man and nodded. A technical failure, he said. Yes, I understand. The man smiled, and the interview was over. Certain things disappeared in those days. Tapes vanished from the archives. Technical logs were confiscated, gathered up in boxes and carried away, never to be seen again. The most detailed data, the radar images of those clean, straight chambers, the thermal maps of that fluctuating heat, the final telemetry with its 3 terrible words, all of it was collected, sealed, removed. What remained in the official record was a sanitized version, a story of a promising mission brought low by ordinary bad luck, a technical failure, nothing more. The surviving members of the team signed their agreements. They swore their oaths of secrecy. They were told, each of them, in that soft, reasonable voice, that the final images were never to be discussed, that the true purpose of the mission was never to be revealed, that the thing they thought they had seen out there in the dark was a smudge, an artifact, a trick of a failing machine, and nothing more. Victor signed. Of course he signed. He had a wife. He had a life. He had learned long ago the price of asking questions too loudly in that country in those years. But before he signed, in the confusion of those first hours, before the quiet men had fully taken control, Victor had done something small, something that would have cost him everything had it ever been discovered. He had made copies, not of everything. He could not have managed that, but of some things, of the images that had struck him most deeply, of a portion of the final telemetry, of his own notes, the observations he had scribbled in the long nights of the approach. He gathered them quietly, folded them small, and hid them where no one would think to look, and he told no one, not even Anya, not even Katya, his wife. He carried the secret alone, as he had carried so many secrets alone, and it lay in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to put down. Because he could not bear it. That was the truth of it. He could not bear the thought that the whole thing would simply vanish, erased from history, unremembered, as though it had never happened. Somewhere out there, a made thing circled a red planet, ancient beyond reckoning, warm at its heart, patient in the dark, and the men in the plain suits wanted the human race to forget it entirely. Victor could not let it be wholly forgotten. Someone had to remember. Someone had to keep the copies, and wait, and hope that a day might come when the truth could finally be told. He did not know that he would wait for the rest of his life. The Soviet Union did not last much longer. 2 years after the silence of Phobos II, the great empire that had built those golden machines and flung them across the void simply came apart. It did not fall in fire and thunder, the way its enemies had always feared. It came apart quietly, almost gently, like a great ship settling into the sea, the water closing over it with hardly a splash. One day it was there, vast and eternal and unquestioned. The next it was gone, and in its place were new countries, new flags, new troubles, and a great deal of confusion. In the chaos of those years, many things were lost. The laboratories emptied, the funding vanished. The great programs that had sent machines to the planets ground to a halt, their engineers scattered to whatever work they could find, their archives left to gather dust in buildings that no one had the money to heat. The careful secret order that had governed everything, that had separated the team and confiscated the tapes and sworn everyone to silence, that order dissolved along with the country that had created it. The quiet men in their plain suits found themselves with new masters, or no masters at all, and the secrets they had guarded so fiercely were suddenly just old papers in forgotten rooms, watched over by no one. The mystery of Phobos, of Object 7, of the hollow moon with its clean straight chambers and its warm and beating heart, faded into obscurity. The scientist grew old. Grigory, the engineer with the enormous hands, died of a heart attack in the winter of the Great Collapse. His daughter's grown now, his toolbox with its taped photograph long since lost. Anya, brilliant impatient Anya, emigrated in the confusion of those years, went west, took a new name, built a new life, and never spoke of the moon again to anyone. Pavel Antonovich, the old conscience of the group, lived a few more years, and then died quietly in his sleep, and whatever he had known, whatever he had believed, went into the ground with him. And Viktor Leonov grew old too. He kept his copies, hidden, all through those years. He watched the world move on and forget. He read, sometimes in the newspapers, brief mentions of the failed Soviet missions to Mars, described always as technical failures, minor footnotes in the long history of space exploration. He watched other nations send their own machines to the Red Planet, watched them succeed where the Soviets had failed, watched them photograph and map and explore, and he waited, always, for one of them to draw close to the little moon, to that small, dark, hollow thing, and to see what he had seen. But they never did. They studied Mars itself, the great planet, and mostly left its little moon alone, as though, without ever knowing why, the whole human race had quietly decided to stay away. Most of the world forgot. Victor did not. Let your thoughts drift now, slow and unhurried, like leaves on the surface of a pond. We have come a long way, you and I, through cold rooms and locked archives, out to a red planet and back again. There is not much further to go. But the last part of the story is the strangest of all, and it did not happen in the time of empires. It happened much more recently. It happened, in a sense now. Decades passed. The world became a different place. The Cold War that had shaped everything faded into history, a thing read about in books, hard for younger people to even imagine. The Soviet Union became a memory. The golden machines that had flown to Mars became footnotes, then were forgotten even as footnotes, remembered only by a handful of historians and enthusiasts who cared about such things. And it was one of those historians who found the thread again. Her name was Elena Markovich. She was an aerospace historian, a careful, patient scholar who had spent her career piecing together the forgotten story of the Soviet space program from the scattered wreckage of its archives. It was slow work, unglamorous work. The records had been dispersed across many countries when the Union collapsed, boxed up and shipped off and stored in basements and warehouses, catalogued badly or not at all. Much had been lost. Much more had simply been misplaced, waiting in the dark for someone patient enough to find it. Eleanor was patient. She was working one long summer in an archive in Kazakhstan, in a low concrete building not far from the old cosmodrome from which those machines had once risen. The building was hot and dusty and smelled of old paper. She spent her days going through box after box of yellowing documents, cataloguing them, photographing them, trying to build a picture of a program that its own government had done its best to obscure. And in one box, among the routine reports and the technical memoranda, she found a reference she did not understand. It was a single phrase in a document about the Phobos missions, a phrase that seemed to refer to something outside the official record. 2 words, Object 7. She almost passed over it. It could have meant anything, a piece of equipment, a coordinate, a routine designation. But something about it caught her, some instinct honed by years of this work, and she made a note of it, and she began, in her spare hours, to pull at the thread. At first she found only more of the same, scattered references in old documents to Object 7, always in connection with the Phobos program, always without explanation. She assumed at first that it was nothing. Cold War paranoia, perhaps, some minor secret bureaucratic matter blown up into a code name, the kind of thing that flourished in a system built on secrecy. She had seen it before. Whole files marked most secret that turned out to concern the procurement of office furniture. But the more she pulled, the stranger it became. The references clustered around the final weeks of the Phobos 2 mission. They appeared in documents that had clearly once been part of a larger set, a set that was now missing, its other pieces removed at some point in the past, and they carried always a peculiar weight, a sense of things unsaid, of fear held carefully in check behind the dry official language. And then, in a box that had come from the estate of a scientist who had died some years before, Eleanor found the notebooks. They were private notebooks, personal ones, bound in worn cloth, filled with a cramped, restless hand, the hand of a man who thought faster than he could write. On the first page was a name, Viktor Leonov. Eleanor did not sleep much the night she began to read those notebooks. They were the record of a man's secret life. They began in the early 1980s with the recruitment of a young astrophysicist into a classified group. They followed him through years of secret work, through debates and calculations and fears, and they built page by page toward the missions to Mars, toward the approach to the little moon, toward the things the instruments had found there. And there were sketches. That was what stopped Elena's breath, alone in her room in the small hours of the morning. Sketches drawn in Leonov's cramped, restless hand of the interior of the moon, clean straight chambers, repeating corridors, vast internal spaces drawn as the radar had revealed them, mapped and labelled and annotated. The interior of a made thing, drawn by a man who had seen it and could not forget it. And on one page, written and underlined and written again, as though the man could not stop his own hand, a single sentence repeated over and over down the length of the paper. The moon is watching. The moon is watching. The moon is watching. Elena Markovich sat very still in the dark, holding the notebook, and felt the whole shape of the thing settle over her like a shadow. This was not office furniture. This was not Cold War paranoia inflated into a code name. This was something else. This was a mystery that had been buried deliberately, carefully, by frightened men in a frightened country, and then forgotten by a world that had moved on to other things. And she was, perhaps, the first person in decades to look at it clearly. She began to compare the notebooks against the official record. It was here that the last piece fell into place. The piece that turned Elena from a curious historian into something more, something that could not turn back. She took Leonov's private notes, his records of the mission, his careful accounts of what the instruments had returned and when, and she laid them beside the public mission records, the official telemetry, the sanitized story of a technical failure. And she found the gaps. Entire sections were missing from the official record. Hours of telemetry that Leonov's notes clearly referred to simply were not there in the public archive. And the gaps were not random. They were precise. They fell, every one of them, in the final phase of the mission, in the last hours before the loss of contact with Phobos 2. Exactly the period Leonov's notes described in the most detail. Exactly the period when the instruments had found the chambers and the heat and the shadow. Exactly the period the official story most wanted to forget. Someone had gone through the record, carefully, deliberately, and cut out the heart of it. Cut out the very hours in which the mission had found what it was looking for. And then patched the record back together, smoothed it over, and told the world that a machine had simply broken, out there in the dark, of ordinary bad luck. Eleanor understood now what she had found. She had found the shape of a cover-up, still visible after all these years in the very gaps it had left behind, like the outline of a missing painting, marked out on a wall by the clean, unfaded rectangle where it had once hung. She had to find the rest. She had to know what had been in those missing hours. And there was, she realised, only one person left who might be able to tell her, if he was still alive. Rest now. You have come so far. The last stretch is close, and it is quieter than what came before, and gentler in its way. Let your breathing slow, and let me tell you about the old man by the sea. Viktor Leonov was still alive. He was very old now, in his 80s, living alone in a small house outside St. Petersburg, near the cold grey waters of the Gulf of Finland. His wife Katya had died some years before. His work was long behind him. He spent his days quietly, reading, walking by the water when the weather allowed, watching the ships pass on the horizon. He had told his secret to no one all these years. He had kept his hidden copies, moving them from house to house as he moved, guarding them without quite knowing why, unable to destroy them and unable to reveal them. When the letter came from the historian, from Elena Markovich, asking to speak with him about the Phobos missions, about Object 7, Viktor sat with it for a long time before he decided to reply. He was old. He knew he did not have many years left. The country that had sworn him to silence was gone, its power dissolved decades ago. The men who had questioned him, who had confiscated the tapes and made him sign his agreements, they were surely all dead by now, or older even than he was, powerless, forgotten. What was there left to fear? What was there left to protect? And there was the other thing, the thing that had gnawed at him for 40 years, the thought that when he died, the truth would die with him, that the whole strange story would sink at last beneath the surface and be gone and no one would ever know. He had kept the copies so that someone someday might remember, and now, at last, someone had come, asking to remember. He wrote back. He said yes. Elena travelled to see him in the autumn. She found the small house by the water, and she found the old man waiting for her, thin and bent, with dark eyes that had lost none of their sharpness. He made her tea. They sat by the window, looking out at the grey water, and for a long time he did not speak of the moon at all. He asked about her work, about the archives, about how she had found his notebooks. He seemed, she thought, to be measuring her, the way perhaps he had once been measured by a quiet man in a plain suit long ago. And then, when the light was beginning to fade over the water, he told her. He told her everything. The windowless room in Moscow, the old man, Pavel Antonovich, and the folder, and the list of anomalies, and the title at the top of the page, the secret group, the hidden instruments, the years of debate, the launches, and the loss of the first machine, and the fear that followed, and then the approach, and the readings, and the images, the hollow moon, the clean straight chambers, the warmth in the deep, rising and falling like a slow breath, the shadow against the sky, and the 3 words glowing on the screen in the last moment before the silence. Unknown object detected. Elena listened and did not interrupt, and let the old man empty out the secret he had carried for 40 years. When he had finished, she asked him the question that mattered most, the question she had crossed half a continent to ask. What were they afraid of, she said. The leadership, the men who took the tapes, when they understood what you had found. What frightened them so much that they buried the whole thing and swore you all to silence and cut the heart out of the record? Victor was quiet for a while. He looked out at the darkening water. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. You think they were afraid it was artificial, he said. That is what everyone assumes. That the great secret was simply the fact of it. That there was a made thing out there. Proof that we are not alone. And they could not bear for the world to know. He shook his head slowly. But no, that is not what frightened them. Not really. If it had only been artificial, only ancient, only a ruin left by someone long gone, they might have found the courage to reveal it in time. A dead monument, a tomb in the sky. Frightening, yes, but bearable. He turned from the window and looked at her, and in his old eyes she saw the fear that had lived there for 40 years, undimmed by all the decades. They were not afraid that it was artificial, he said. They were afraid that it was operational, that it was not a ruin, but a machine still running, that the heat we found was an engine still turning, that the shadow we saw was not a corpse but a thing that could move, that when our little probe came close and reached out to touch it, the machine had noticed and reached back and switched our machine off, the way you might brush away a fly. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. They were afraid, Elena Markovich, that it was still awake, and that we had knocked on its door. The room was silent. Outside, the last light died over the gulf, and the water went black. The scientists had reached a conclusion in those final secret weeks that they had never dared to write down in full. Victor gave it to Elena now, piece by piece, the hidden theory that the 12 had arrived at in their locked rooms and never spoken aloud beyond them. Phobos, they had come to believe, was not a spacecraft, not a vessel that had travelled from somewhere else and parked itself in orbit. It was older than that and stranger. It was a station, a platform, an installation, placed deliberately in orbit around Mars in the deep and unimaginable past, long before there were human beings, long before there was human history, long before the first of our ancestors ever looked up at the red wandering star and gave it the name of a god of war. And it had been placed there for a reason. Mars was never the destination, Victor said. That was the thing we came to understand at the very end. We had always assumed Mars was the point, that whoever built the station had some interest in the red planet itself. But no, Mars was not the destination. Mars was the checkpoint. Eleanor frowned. The checkpoint for what? For us, the old man said simply. For anyone. Think of it. If you wished to know when a young civilization on some small blue planet had grown advanced enough to become interesting or dangerous, how would you know? You cannot watch every world in the sky forever, but you could place a watcher, not on the young planet itself, where it might be found too soon, but nearby, on the next world out. A sentinel, sleeping in orbit around the red planet, waiting, because a civilization that can only crawl about on its own world is no concern to anyone, but a civilization that has learned to leave its home planet, to cross the void to another world, that has reached out and touched the next planet in its system. He spread his old hands. That is a civilization worth noticing. That is a civilization that has crossed a threshold. And the moment we did, the moment our little probe reached out and touched the sentinel that had been waiting all those millions of years, we announced ourselves. We rang the bell. We said, to whoever built it and to whatever it reports to, here we are. We have arrived. We're ready to be noticed." Elena felt the cold of it settle into her, the same cold that had touched Victor in a windowless room half a century before and had never fully left him since. "That is why they buried it," she said slowly, "not to hide the fact that we are not alone, but to hide the fact that we had woken something, that we had drawn attention to ourselves, that somewhere out there, because of what we did, someone or something now knew that we existed." "Yes," Victor said, "you understand now. They could not bear it. Not the knowledge itself, but the responsibility of it. To be the men who woke the sentinel. To be the generation that rang the bell. Easier, far easier to call it a technical failure, to cut the record, to swear everyone to silence, and to pray that whatever we had woken would simply go back to sleep and forget and leave us alone." He rose then, slowly, painfully, and crossed to an old cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it, and from the back of a drawer he drew out a small flat object, wrapped in cloth. He carried it back and set it in Elena's hands. It was a reel of tape, old magnetic tape, of a kind hardly used anymore. On the label, in faded ink, in that same cramped, restless hand she had come to know from the notebooks, were a few words. March 1989. Eyes only. "I made copies," Victor said. "In the confusion, before they took everything, I made copies of a few things. This was one of them. I have kept it for 40 years. I have never played it, not once. I could not bear to." He looked at the reel in her hands and then at her face. "I am too old now, and too tired, to be the one who tells the world. But you are young, and you are patient, and you have found me when no one else did, so I give it to you. Do with it what you think is right." Eleanor looked down at the reel in her hands, the small ordinary object that held, perhaps, the final moments of a machine that had flown to Mars and touched something ancient and never come home. "What is on it?" she asked quietly. Victor sat back down. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering himself. "The last images," he said. "The final feed from Phobos 2, in the moments before we lost it. The men who took the tapes never knew this copy existed." He closed his eyes. "I did watch it once, Elena Markovich. I lied to you a moment ago. I said I never played it. That is not true. I watched it once, 40 years ago, alone in the first days after we lost the mission, before I hid it away. And what I saw on it, I have never been able to forget, not for a single night since." "What did you see?" He opened his eyes, and when he spoke his voice was steady but very low, the voice of a man reciting something he had gone over 1,000 times in the dark. "You know the famous photograph," he said, "the shadow, the long dark shape against the Martian sky, the one the world was eventually shown and told was an artifact, a smudge, a flaw in the camera. You know it." "I know it," Elena said. "That photograph was a single frame," Victor said. "One still image, pulled from a sequence. The world was shown the one frame and told it meant nothing." He leaned forward. "But the tape is not a single frame. The tape is the whole sequence. Many frames, one after another, showing that shadow across several seconds of time." He paused. "And in those seconds," he said, "the shadow moves." The room was utterly silent. "It does not drift, the way a smudge would drift as the camera shifts. It does not blur or fade the way an artifact would. It moves with purpose. It changes direction. In the space of a few frames, that long dark shape against the sky turns, deliberately, the way a living thing turns, the way a thing that has noticed something turns to look at it." His old hands were trembling now. "And then the feed cuts to black, and that is the last thing Phobos 2 ever sent us. A shadow, turning to look, and then nothing." Elena Markovich sat very still, holding the reel of tape in her hands, and did not speak, because there was nothing that could be said. Outside in the darkness the cold water of the gulf lapped against the shore, patient and endless, as it had for longer than there had been anyone to hear it. "Let your breathing slow now. all the way down, soft and even. We are nearly to the end. There is nothing left in this story that can frighten you, only the quiet that comes after. The long quiet that these things always seem to sink back into. Stay with me for the last few moments. Viktor Leonov died the following spring. He died quietly, in his small house by the water, an old man at the end of a long life, and if he carried any secrets with him into the dark, they were only the small ones now, the personal ones, the memories of a wife and a life and a career. The great secret he had given away at last into the hands of the young historian who had come looking for it. Elena Markovich did with the reel what she believed was right. She had it carefully digitized, preserved, its contents, studied by people she trusted, and in time, she published. Not everything, for she was a careful scholar and knew the difference between what could be proven and what could only be believed. But she published the documents, the notebooks, the record of the gaps in the official archive, the account of what the Soviet scientists had found and what they had come to fear. She laid it all out, honestly, and let the world make of it what it would. The world, as it so often does, mostly made nothing of it. The experts examined her evidence and offered their explanations. The gravity readings, they said, could be misinterpreted. The radar images could be artifacts of the instrument. The heat could be natural. The shadow, the famous shadow, was surely still just a smudge, a flaw, a trick of a failing camera, and the notion that it moved was surely just the imagination of a frightened old man, embroidering his memories over 40 long years of solitude. The whole thing, they concluded, was a fascinating piece of Cold War history, a window into the paranoia and secrecy of a vanished empire and nothing more. There was no sentinel, there was no watcher, there was only a failed mission and a frightened bureaucracy and the very human tendency to see patterns and purposes in the random accidents of a difficult machine in a difficult place. Governments, asked about the matter, said nothing at all, which is what governments usually say. And the world moved on. It always moves on. The story surfaced for a little while, in certain corners of the internet, among certain kinds of people, and then it sank again. The way these stories always sink, back beneath the surface of a world too busy to remember. But Elena Markovich, like Viktor before her, did not entirely forget. And there was one more thing, one last detail that she found in the very final stages of her work, that she was never quite able to explain away, and that she left, deliberately, as the closing note of everything she published, so that anyone who read to the end would carry it with them, as she carried it, as Viktor had carried it before her. Among the declassified Soviet documents, in a memorandum dated to the spring of 1989, in the weeks just after the loss of Phobos 2, there was a single instruction. It concerned future missions, future plans, the long dreams of exploring Mars and its moons that every space program cherished. And in that dry official memorandum, among the routine language of planning and policy, there was one line standing alone, without elaboration, without explanation, as though whoever wrote it had known exactly what they meant, and had assumed the reader would too. Further approach to Object 7 is not recommended. That was all. No reason was given, no justification, no account of what Object 7 was, or why approaching it was inadvisable, or what might happen if the recommendation were ignored. Just those few words, set down by some unnamed official in the last days of a dying empire, and then filed away and forgotten, and finally, decades later, brought back into the light by a patient historian who could not stop pulling at a thread. Further approach to Object 7 is not recommended. Somewhere out there, tonight, as you lie warm and safe in your bed drifting towards sleep, that small dark moon still circles the red planet. It has circled it for longer than there have been human beings to wonder about it, and it will go on circling long after we're gone. Perhaps it is only a rock, a captured asteroid, a loose pile of rubble with a few strange features that frighten some clever men in a frightened time. That is the likeliest thing. That is what the experts say, and the experts are usually right. Or perhaps, deep inside it, In the clean, straight chambers no human eye has ever truly seen, something still waits, something patient, something that noticed us once, long ago, when we reached out across the dark and touched it, something that is watching, still, and waiting to see what we will do next. History remembers Phobos as a failed Soviet mission to a Martian moon. According to the conspiracy, it was humanity's first encounter with a machine that had been waiting in the darkness long before the first human being ever looked up toward Mars and wondered and gave it the name of fear. And that is where we will leave it tonight. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using those hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to, of course. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really builds this incredible community of curious minds from every corner of the globe. Also, a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. Now, let's get into it. The Hynek Files. The scientist who saw too much. Imagine being the person the government calls when they need someone to make the impossible sound ordinary. Imagine spending 3 decades explaining away what you know, deep down, cannot be explained. Imagine carrying secrets so heavy that even on your deathbed you can only hint at the truth. This is the story of J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who became the Air Force's chief UFO debunker, only to become the phenomenon's most credible believer. A man who spent 22 years inside Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program. A man who, by the end of his life, was convinced the government had been hiding the real story all along, and 3 months after giving his final interview, he was dead. The tapes from that interview, gone, vanished from a university archive by someone who never signed in. This is where documented truth becomes stranger than fiction. The last interview, April 1986, Evanston, Illinois. The room is small, cluttered with star charts and aging textbooks. Afternoon light filters through half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the desk where J. Allen Hynek sits, 75 years old, his face lined with decades of secrets. Across from him, a graduate student adjusts a tape recorder. Her name is Rebecca Marks, though she won't become important to this story until much later. This is supposed to be a simple oral history project for Northwestern University, nothing more than an elderly professor reflecting on his career in astronomy. Standard academic documentation. But Hynek keeps glancing at the door. The student notices but doesn't comment. She's young, maybe 23, and she's done her research. She knows Hynek spent more than 2 decades as the scientific consultant to the Air Force's UFO investigation programs. She knows about Project Blue Book. She knows about the swamp gas explanation that made him a punchline in 1966. What she doesn't know yet is that this interview will haunt her for the rest of her life. They talk for 90 minutes. Hynek is measured, careful, professional. He discusses stellar classification, his work at Ohio State, the development of satellite tracking systems, all safe territory. His answers are the kind you'd expect from any distinguished astronomer nearing the end of his career. Thoughtful, precise, unremarkable. Rebecca notices his coffee cup. He's barely touched it. His hands rest on the desk, but his fingers keep tapping in a regular rhythm against the wood. Nervous energy from a man who spent his entire career projecting calm authority. Then, as she's packing up the recorder, reaching for the power button, Hinek speaks again. His voice is different now, quieter, urgent, almost a whisper. History will remember Project Blue Book as an investigation, he says, but it was really a filter. The real cases never reached the public. Rebecca's hand freezes over the recorder. She looks at him. What do you mean, the real cases? Hynek's hands are shaking slightly. He's staring at something beyond her, beyond the room, as if seeing through the walls into some distant memory he's carried for too long. The ones they told me not to classify as unexplained. The ones where the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too troubling. He pauses, and in that silence Rebecca can hear the buildings settle around them. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Sheridan Road. There were files I could never see, Hinek continues. Reports removed before I arrived. Witnesses told to recant their statements. Photographs that disappeared before analysis. Who told them to recant? Hynek just shakes his head slowly. People who decided what the public could handle. People who understood that some truths destabilize entire systems of belief. Rebecca asks if she can keep recording. Hynek says no, but he keeps talking anyway for another 20 minutes, off the record. She frantically pulls out a notebook and scribbles, trying to capture every word. He mentions cases by location and date, incidents she's never heard of. A radar tracking event over Montana in 1953 involving multiple installations. Visual confirmations by commercial pilots over the Great Lakes in 1961. Objects tracked across state lines, moving at speeds that made no aerodynamic sense. Physical evidence, burned soil, electromagnetic interference, radiation signatures that disappeared into classified channels before civilian scientists could examine it. Why didn't you say something publicly, she asks, her pen moving rapidly across the page. I tried, Hynek replies, and there's something broken in his voice now. In my way, carefully, I spoke at universities. I wrote papers with coded language. I built networks with other researchers. But there are people who don't want this conversation to happen. Not because they're evil, necessarily. Because they're terrified of what it means. He leans forward, and Rebecca sees something in his eyes she'll remember for the rest of her life. Not fear, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who's carried a weight too heavy for too long. Do you know what happens when you tell the public that everything they believe about reality might be incomplete? When you suggest that non-human intelligence has been interacting with us, studying us, for decades? The social structures we've built, religion, science, government authority, they all rest on certain assumptions. You pull one thread. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. Before she leaves, he tells her one more thing. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. 3 months later, J. Allen Hynek is dead. Heart attack. Nothing suspicious on paper. The obituaries call him a distinguished astronomer and the scientific advisor to Project Blue Book. They mention his later work founding the Center for UFO Studies. They're respectful, brief, forgettable. When Rebecca Marks returns to the university archive 2 weeks later to review the interview tape for her thesis, she's told it's missing. The archive log shows someone checked it out 6 days after Hynek's death. No name, no signature, no ID number, just a checkout date and time, May 3rd, 1986, 2:15 p.m. Rebecca files a complaint. The university apologises, calls it an administrative error. The tape is never found. She asks to see security footage from the archive reading room. She's told the system was malfunctioning that week. She contacts the campus police. They file a report and nothing happens. Years later, after she's completed her PhD and moved into a career in science journalism, Rebecca will occasionally Google J. Allen Hynek's name. She'll read the conspiracy forums, the UFO research sites, the academic papers analysing Project Blue Book's methodology, and she'll wonder if Hynek knew his time was running out, if that interview was his last attempt to leave breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow them, if he suspected someone was listening, watching, waiting for him to say too much. She still has her handwritten notes from those 20 minutes after the recording stopped. She keeps them in a safe deposit box. She's never published them. She's not sure she ever will. But sometimes, late at night, she takes them out and reads them again, and she thinks about what Hynek said. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. The public history versus the secret history. To understand what Hynek knew and why it terrified him, you have to understand who he was before the Air Force recruited him. Joseph Allen Hynek was born May 1st, 1915 in Chicago, son of Czech immigrants who'd fled Europe seeking opportunity and stability. His father worked in a cigar factory. His mother took in sewing. They were working-class people who valued education above everything else. From childhood, Hynek was obsessed with the stars. He'd spend hours on the roof of their apartment building with a homemade telescope, charting constellations, tracking planets. His parents couldn't afford books, so he haunted the public library, devouring everything he could find about astronomy, physics, mathematics. He was brilliant. Everyone knew it. Teachers, neighbours, family friends. By age 12, he was doing university-level mathematics. By 15, he taught himself calculus. He earned a scholarship to the University of Chicago, then completed his doctorate in astrophysics by age 24. His dissertation on stellar spectroscopy, the analysis of starlight to determine a star's composition and characteristics, was considered groundbreaking work. By 1940, he'd secured a faculty position at Ohio State University. By all accounts, he was living the dream. A kid from a working-class immigrant family who'd become a respected scientist. In the academic world, Hynek was known as meticulous, sceptical, grounded in observable data. He had no patience for speculation or pseudoscience. He believed the universe could be understood through measurement, mathematics, and careful observation. He did not believe in flying saucers. When the UFO phenomenon exploded across America in the late 1940s, after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier in June 1947, after the Roswell incident weeks later, after hundreds of reports began flooding military installations, Hynek thought it was mass hysteria. Post-war anxiety manifesting as delusion. People seeing aircraft and planets and making them into something alien. He said as much in faculty meetings. He wrote dismissive letters to colleagues who took the subject seriously. He considered the whole thing beneath serious scientific inquiry, which is exactly why the Air Force wanted him. 1948. The United States military is hemorrhaging credibility over UFO reports. Pilots, combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, are seeing objects that outperform any known aircraft. Radar operators are tracking things moving at speeds that should tear apart any physical object. The public is fascinated and increasingly convinced the government is hiding something. The Air Force needs someone with impeccable scientific credentials to calm things down. Someone who can look at the data and confidently say, weather balloons, temperature inversions, atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, optical illusions. Someone who doesn't believe in flying saucers. J. Allen Hynek seemed perfect for the job. He's recruited into Project Sign, the Air Force's first official UFO study, in late 1948. The initial contact comes through official channels, a letter on Air Force letterhead, signed by a general Hynek has never heard of. Would he be interested in consulting on a scientific matter related to aerial phenomena? Compensation provided. Minimal time commitment. Purely advisory role. Hynek is intrigued, and honestly, a little amused. He sees it as an opportunity to apply real science to a question that's become hopelessly muddied by speculation and sensationalism. His job is simple: review sighting reports and provide scientific explanations, and at first that's exactly what he does. A pilot reports seeing a disc-shaped object. Hynek explains it's likely a lenticular cloud formation, which can appear metallic in certain lighting conditions. Radar picks up an unidentified blip. Temperature inversion, he says. Under certain atmospheric conditions, radar waves can bounce off warm air layers, creating false returns. Multiple witnesses see strange lights. Venus, he explains patiently. At certain times of year, Venus appears exceptionally bright and can seem to move due to atmospheric distortion and the observer's own motion. He explains away lights in the sky as Venus, Jupiter, meteors, balloons, experimental aircraft, strange radar blips as temperature anomalies, equipment malfunctions, birds flocking in formation. Pilot reports as optical illusions caused by fatigue, reflected starlight, or misidentified conventional aircraft. Publicly, he tells the press, most UFO sightings can be explained by natural phenomena or misidentification. When you apply rigorous scientific analysis, the mystery disappears. The Air Force loves him. The press quotes him. Skeptics cite him. He becomes known as the scientific voice of reason in a field dominated by speculation. Internally, though, something begins to shift, because some cases don't fit the script. There are reports where Venus can't be the answer because Venus wasn't visible in that part of the sky at that time, where temperature inversions can't explain radar returns because the atmospheric conditions were documented and stable, where pilot testimony is too detailed, too specific, too consistent with physical evidence on the ground. Hynek starts keeping two sets of notes. The official reports he submits to the Air Force, carefully worded to provide conventional explanations, and his personal observations filed away in notebooks he keeps locked in his office. In those personal notes, a pattern begins to emerge. A growing sense that he's not investigating a phenomenon, he's managing one. Project Grudge and the first red flags. By 1951, Project Sign has been quietly restructured into Project Grudge. The name change isn't subtle, and that's the point. Grudge was chosen deliberately. It reflected the Air Force's official stance that UFO reports were a nuisance, a distraction from real national security concerns like the Soviet threat and the Korean War. The mission was no longer investigation, it was dismissal. Hynek noticed the change immediately. The tone of the briefing shifted. The types of cases sent to him changed. Suddenly the most intriguing reports, the ones with multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, weren't reaching his desk anymore. Instead, he received obvious misidentifications, hoaxes, reports that were easy to debunk, cases designed to make the entire phenomenon look foolish. When he asked about the more credible cases he'd heard about through military channels, he was told they were being handled by other departments, national security concerns, need-to-know basis. He started keeping more detailed personal notes, fragments that would later surface in his private papers, giving researchers a glimpse into his growing disillusionment. One entry, dated September 1951, received truncated report on Utah sighting. Multiple witnesses, including commercial pilot and ground observers. Witness claimed the object descended vertically at high speed, hovered approximately 200 feet above desert floor for estimated 45 seconds, then accelerated horizontally, disappearing from view in under 3 seconds. Radar confirmation mentioned in initial summary but absent from final report sent to me. When I requested full radar logs, told they were unavailable due to equipment malfunction. 3 different radar stations experienced simultaneous equipment malfunction. The statistical probability approaches 0. Hynek was starting to see a pattern. The most compelling evidence was being filtered out before it could reach him. He began making inquiries through unofficial channels, conversations with radar technicians at air traffic control centres, informal discussions with pilots he knew from his work at Ohio State. What he heard troubled him deeply. The cases were real, the radar data existed, the photographs were clear. But somewhere between the initial report and official investigation, crucial details were disappearing. And then something stranger happened, something that convinced Hynek he was under surveillance. He wrote a letter to a colleague at another university, an astronomer named Thomas Gillespie, who he'd known since graduate school. The letter was carefully worded, but it asked a pointed question. Have you noticed institutional resistance to objective UFO study? I'm finding it increasingly difficult to access primary source data. Hynek mailed the letter from the campus post office on a Tuesday morning. He remembered because he had a faculty meeting immediately afterward. The letter never arrived. 2 weeks later, Hynek called Gillespie to follow up. Gillespie said he'd received no letter. Hynek contacted the postal service. They had no record of it being lost or returned. It had been properly stamped, properly addressed. It simply vanished somewhere between the Columbus post office and Berkeley, California. One lost letter might be coincidence. But Hynek had mailed other correspondence that same day. Personal letters to family, a note to a colleague about an upcoming conference. All of those arrived without issue. Just the letter about UFOs disappeared. Hynek wrote in his journal that night, "The phenomenon is not being studied, it is being buried, and I suspect anyone asking too many questions is being watched." That's when he began to suspect he wasn't working for an investigation. He was working for a containment operation, and his role wasn't to find the truth, it was to provide plausible deniability. He considered resigning, but he realised that leaving would mean losing any access he had, however limited. At least inside the program he could see some of the data. He could document the inconsistencies. He could perhaps slowly build a case for the phenomenon's legitimacy. So he stayed. But he stopped trusting his employers, and he started preparing for the possibility that someday someone would need to know what he'd witnessed. Project Blue Book and 22 years of controlled access. 1952, Project Grudge becomes Project Blue Book, a name chosen to sound official, scientific, comprehensive. The rebranding was deliberate. The Air Force needed to convince the public and Congress that they were taking the UFO question seriously. Project Blue Book was given more resources, better staffing, improved investigative protocols. On paper, it looked like a legitimate scientific endeavour. To the public, Blue Book represented the government's good faith effort to understand the UFO phenomenon. It had scientists, standardised reporting forms, investigative teams dispatched to interview witnesses. It published annual reports. It looked legitimate. J. Allen Hynek was appointed Chief Scientific Consultant. His name lent credibility. His presence suggested serious scientific inquiry. For the next 22 years, from 1952 to 1969, he would review thousands of cases. Officially, Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO reports during its operational lifetime. Hynek later claimed that number was misleading on multiple levels. Many explainable cases, he said, were exaggerated to make the Air Force look thorough. Simple misidentifications, aircraft lights, bright planets, obvious hoaxes, were written up as detailed investigations to pad the statistics. The message, look how many cases we solve. Meanwhile, many genuinely unexplainable cases were either downgraded, reclassified, or removed from the archive entirely before final publication. The process worked like this. A UFO report would come in through military or civilian channels. An initial investigation would be conducted. Witness interviews, site visits, photographic analysis, radar data collection. If the case was easily explainable, it went straight to Blue Book's official files. If the case was complex or unexplainable, it went somewhere else first. Somewhere Hynek didn't have access to. When, or if, he eventually saw it, crucial details had been removed or altered. Witness statements mentioning structured craft were summarised as unusual light in sky. Radar data confirming visual sightings was classified as equipment anomaly. Photographs showing clear objects were deemed inconclusive or possible lens flare. Multiple independent witnesses were reduced to single. Observer report. Hynek was given edited versions of reality. He began to realise he was seeing a curated version of the phenomenon, the parts someone had decided were safe for him to analyse and publicly explain. He started keeping more extensive personal records. After official investigations, he would quietly contact witnesses directly, conducting informal follow-up interviews. What they told him often contradicted the official reports he'd received. He also began networking with other researchers who were noticing the same patterns, scientists and military personnel who suspected the official investigation was a facade. The cases that broke him. 2 events changed Hynek from skeptic to believer. Both were real, both remain unexplained, and both revealed just how much the Air Force was willing to manipulate the truth. The Lubbock Lights, August 25, 1951, Lubbock, Texas. 4 college professors are sitting in a backyard enjoying the warm evening air and discussing micrometeorites. These aren't random civilians. They're scientists from Texas Tech. A chemist, a physicist, a petroleum engineer, and a geologist. Professional observers trained to document phenomena accurately. At 9:20 p.m, one of them happens to glance up. What the hell is that? A formation of the lights is moving across the sky. Not random lights. A perfect V-shaped pattern, like birds flying in formation, but faster than any bird could fly. The lights are bright, bluish-white, distinct against the night sky. The formation covers the entire visible sky in about 3 seconds. That's an angular velocity that suggests incredible speed, potentially thousands of miles per hour depending on altitude. The professors barely have time to process what they've seen before it's gone. They sit in stunned silence for a moment, then immediately begin comparing observations. What colour were the lights? How many? What was the exact pattern? How fast were they moving? Their accounts match perfectly. 20 to 30 lights, bluish-white, V-shaped formation, silent, moving from north to south. Then, 18 minutes later, it happens again. Same formation, same speed, same trajectory. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appear multiple times. Dozens of Lubbock residents see them. The local newspaper runs stories. The sightings make national news. On August 30th, a Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. photographs them. He sets up his camera in his backyard, and when the lights appear, he captures 5 clear photographs. The images show the V formation exactly as witnesses described, multiple lights in perfect geometric arrangement. The photographs are remarkably clear. Hart brings them to the newspaper, which publishes them on the front page. The images go national. Life magazine runs them. They become some of the most famous UFO photographs of the era. The Air Force dispatches investigators. Hynek reviews the case file, and he cannot explain it. He interviews the professors personally. These are credible witnesses, trained observers with nothing to gain from fabricating a story. Their descriptions are consistent, detailed, and sober. He examines Hart's photographs. They're not hoaxes. Analysis shows no evidence of double exposure or manipulation. The lights are real. Physical objects photographed over multiple frames. He considers conventional explanations. Aircraft? No aircraft flies in that type of formation or at that speed. Meteors? Meteors don't move in perfect geometric patterns or repeat the same trajectory multiple times over 2 weeks. Reflections? Reflections don't appear to multiple witnesses in different locations and don't move consistently across the sky. Hynek writes in his official analysis, "The lights exhibited intelligent control. They moved in coordinated formations at speeds inconsistent with known aircraft. The photographic evidence is compelling. Multiple credible witnesses with consistent testimony. I cannot provide a conventional explanation that adequately accounts for all observed phenomena." That report goes up the chain of command. When the official Blue Book conclusion is published, the Lubbock lights are attributed to birds reflecting streetlights. Birds? Hynek is furious. He knows this explanation is absurd. Birds don't fly in perfect V formations at supersonic speeds. Birds don't glow with bluish-white luminescence. Birds don't maintain geometric precision while covering the entire visible sky in 3 seconds. But the case is closed. The Air Force has its explanation, and the press runs with it. The Lubbock lights become a joke. Scientists fooled by birds. Hynek tries to push back. He submits a revised report, arguing that the bird explanation doesn't match the data. His report is rejected. He's told the case is resolved and further analysis is unnecessary. That's when Hynek begins to understand his real role. He's not there to investigate. He's there to provide scientific cover for predetermined conclusions. In his private notes he writes, "They don't want truth. They want closure. My job is to make the impossible sound ordinary, regardless of evidence." The Lubbock Lights case stays with him for the rest of his life. In later years, after he'd left Blue Book, he would publicly state that the case remained unexplained and that the official explanation was inadequate. But by then, the damage was done. The public believed the case was solved. The Lonnie Zamora incident. If the Lubbock Lights troubled Hynek, the Lonnie Zamora incident shattered his remaining skepticism. April 24th, 1964. Socorro, New Mexico. Late afternoon, just before sunset. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora is pursuing a speeding car south of town when he hears a loud roar and sees flames in the distance. His first thought is that the dynamite shack on the edge of town has exploded. He abandons the traffic stop and drives toward the site. The terrain is rough, rocky arroyos and scrub brush. Zamora follows a dirt road up a small hill, struggling to keep his patrol car under control on the loose gravel. He reaches the top of the hill and looks down into the arroyo below. What he sees makes no sense. There's an object resting on the ground. It's oval-shaped, white, smooth, about the size of a car, but the proportions are wrong, wider than it is tall. It's resting on metallic legs, 4 of them, arranged like landing struts. Beside the object stand 2 figures. They're small, as Zamora later estimates around 4 feet tall. They're wearing what look like white coveralls or jumpsuits, one-piece garments, no visible seams. Their proportions seem slightly off in ways Zamora can't quite articulate. The head-to-body ratio isn't quite right. Their movements are too quick, too smooth. Zamora is about 150 yards away. He can't see their faces clearly, but he can see them moving around the object, apparently working on something. Then one of them notices him. The figures react immediately. They move quickly, not running exactly, but moving with a strange fluidity, back toward the object. One disappears around the far side. The other seems to climb or step into an opening Zamora can't quite see. Seconds later, the roar returns. Deafening. Zamora describes it as similar to jet engines, but deeper, more resonant. The object begins to glow at the bottom, a bluish-orange flame that doesn't look like combustion. Zamora panics. He thinks it's going to explode. He runs back toward his patrol car, stumbling in the rocks, certain he's about to be incinerated. The roar reaches a crescendo. When Zamora risks a look back, the object is airborne. It hovers briefly, maybe 20 feet off the ground, then begins moving. Not with the acceleration curve of normal aircraft. It goes from hovering to high-speed flight almost instantaneously, moving low across the desert terrain, following the contours of the land. Within seconds, it's gone. Complete silence returns. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Zamora immediately radios the sheriff's office. "You're not going to believe what I just saw." Sergeant Sam Chavez arrives within minutes. Together, they go back to the site. The evidence is undeniable. 4 distinct depressions in the hard-packed earth where the landing legs rested. The soil is compressed and shows clear patterns consistent with something heavy bearing down. Burn marks on the desert scrub. Several bushes are charred, still smouldering slightly. The burn patterns are strange, focused in specific areas but not spreading the way a normal fire would. The ground where the object had been is disturbed, smooth in a way that doesn't match the surrounding terrain. Chavez radios for backup. More officers arrive. An FBI agent arrives. The Air Force is notified. Within 24 hours, Project Blue Book dispatches an investigator. Within 48 hours, J. Allen Hynek himself arrives in Socorro. Hynek interviews Zamora extensively. He examines the physical evidence. He talks to other officers who responded. He documents everything meticulously, and he believes Zamora completely. Zamora is a respected officer with 12 years of service. No history of exaggeration, mental instability, or attention-seeking behaviour. He's known in the community as reliable, level-headed, professional. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story. In fact, he's embarrassed by the attention. He doesn't like talking about it. He's worried it will affect his career. The physical evidence matches his account perfectly. The landing impressions are real. The burn marks are real. The timeline is documented. His radio communications provide a precise record of when he called in the sighting and when other officers arrived. Hynek spends 2 days in Socorro. He walks the site repeatedly. He measures the landing impressions, he interviews witnesses who saw the object from a distance. He checks astronomical data to rule out any conventional explanation. There is no conventional explanation. This wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a helicopter. It was an experimental military craft. The Air Force checked with White Sands Missile Range and Holloman Air Force Base. Nothing was flying in that area at that time. Hynek writes a classified memo to Blue Book headquarters. This case bothers me deeply. The witness is credible. The evidence is physical and documented. The object described exhibits characteristics beyond any known technology. This may be the most significant case we've encountered. It may be the Roswell of my time. That memo is classified and filed separately from the main Blue Book archive. It never appears in the official reports. Publicly, the case is listed as unidentified, one of the few cases Blue Book couldn't explain away, but the official stance is carefully neutral. We don't know what it was, but there's no evidence it was extraterrestrial. Hynek knows the truth is more complicated. He knows what Zamora saw was real. He knows the object displayed intelligent control and technology far beyond human capability. But he also knows he can't say that publicly without destroying his credibility and his access to future cases. So he does what he's been doing for 16 years. He speaks carefully, hints at the truth, and waits for the day when he might be able to tell the full story. That day never quite comes. The Lonnie Zamora incident remains one of the most credible and well-documented UFO cases in history. Even hardcore skeptics struggle to dismiss it. The witness is too reliable, the evidence too physical, the investigation too thorough. But it also becomes a turning point for Hynek. After Socorro, he can no longer pretend he's dealing with misidentifications and psychological phenomena. Something real is happening. Something that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. And the people running Project Blue Book know it, which is why they're working so hard to keep cases like this from reaching the public eye. The Unseen Files. Years after Blue Book closed, Air Force Colonel Robert Friend, who served as director of Project Blue Book from 1958 to 1963, began speaking more openly about what the program really was. In a 1998 interview, he confirmed what Hynek had long suspected. Blue Book operated 2 filing systems. One was public. The reports shared with Congress, the media, civilian researchers, and consultants like Hynek. This archive was carefully curated to present UFO reports as primarily explainable, or at least manageable. The other was classified, a parallel archive containing cases the Air Force considered genuinely sensitive. These cases involved military pilots reporting structured craft during active combat or training missions, radar installations at sensitive facilities tracking objects that couldn't be explained as atmospheric phenomena, incidents near nuclear weapons installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, events where physical evidence was collected, material samples, radiation readings, photographic evidence that suggested advanced technology. Cases involving multiple military witnesses whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. Friend stated in the interview, "There were reports Hynek never saw. Cases that involved national security implications were handled separately. They went to different departments, different channels. Blue Book was the public face. But the serious cases, the ones that really concerned us, those went elsewhere." When the interviewer asked where those cases went, Friend said he didn't know. That information was above his clearance level. Think about that for a moment. The director of Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program, didn't have access to the most important cases. This explained so much of what Hynek had experienced. It explained why he often felt like he was investigating half stories. Because he was. It explained why witnesses would sometimes tell him details that weren't in the official reports he'd received. Because the reports had been edited before reaching him. It explained why he could never quite build a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon. because the most compelling pieces of the puzzle were systematically removed from his view. Hynek was a prop, a scientific facade to give Blue Book credibility, while the real investigations happened in compartmented programs he'd never even hear about. He suspected this during his years with Blue Book, but confirmation wouldn't come until after his death, when researchers began interviewing former military personnel willing to speak more openly. By then, it was too late for Hynek to say, "I told you so." The switch from debunker to believer. By the mid-1960s, Hynek could no longer reconcile what he was being told to say with what he knew to be true. Internally, he was keeping extensive notes documenting the disconnect between evidence and official conclusions. He was quietly networking with other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He was beginning to speak more carefully at academic conferences, hinting at the limitations of Blue Book's methodology. But he was still publicly defending the program, still explaining away cases, still playing his assigned role. The breaking point came in March 1966, during what became known as the Michigan UFO wave. Between March 14th and March 21st, dozens of people across southeastern Michigan reported seeing strange lights maneuvering over fields, forests, and residential areas. The witnesses included police officers, college students, local officials, housewives, farmers, a complete cross-section of the community. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses reported seeing glowing objects that moved erratically, changed colour, hovered in place, then accelerated to high speeds. Some described the objects as disc-shaped. Others saw only the lights. On the night of March 20th, more than 50 people, including 12 police officers, witnessed objects manoeuvring over a swampy area near Dexter, Michigan. The objects were seen for several hours. Multiple independent witnesses described the same phenomena. The sightings made national news. Michigan was in an uproar. Congressman Gerald Ford, who represented the area and would later become president, demanded a congressional hearing. The Air Force was under enormous pressure to provide answers. They dispatched Hynek to Michigan to investigate and, more importantly, to make the story go away. Hynek arrived in Ann Arbor on March 23rd. He spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining the sites, reviewing reports. The evidence troubled him. These weren't obvious misidentifications. The witnesses were credible. Their accounts were detailed and consistent. The duration of the sightings, hours in some cases, ruled out meteors or aircraft. But the Air Force needed an explanation. Now. The press was calling, Congress was watching, the public was demanding answers. On March 25th, Hynek held a press conference. Standing before a room packed with journalists and television cameras, under pressure from his Air Force handlers, he offered an explanation. Swamp gas. He explained that decaying vegetation in marshland can produce marsh gas, primarily methane, which can spontaneously ignite under certain conditions, creating glowing lights that appear to move. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The press erupted in laughter. Reporters shouted questions. "Are you serious? Swamp gas? That's your explanation?" The witnesses felt betrayed. The police officers who'd risked their credibility by reporting what they saw were humiliated. The scientific community was embarrassed for him. Swamp gas creating lights that multiple trained observers watched for hours, moving in coordinated patterns. It was absurd. Within hours, editorial cartoons were mocking him. Headlines declared Air Force blames UFOs on swamp gas. Late-night comedians made jokes. Hynek became a punchline, a government scientist willing to blame anything, no matter how ridiculous, rather than admit the obvious. But what the public didn't know, what wasn't revealed until years later when Hynek's personal papers were examined, was that he had written a very different report before the press conference. In his internal analysis, submitted to Project Blue Book headquarters 3 days before going public, he'd stated, "The objects described by witnesses exhibited controlled, intelligent movement inconsistent with natural phenomena. They manoeuvred with flight characteristics beyond human capability, instant acceleration, stationary hovering, coordinated group behaviour." Multiple independent witnesses, including trained observers, provide consistent testimony. Physical evidence includes electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition systems and compass anomalies. Swamp gas does not adequately explain the observed phenomena. This case deserves serious scientific study, not dismissal. That report was rewritten before release. Hynek was told to stick to the swamp gas explanation or resign from Blue Book. He could have resigned. He could have held the press conference and said, "I don't know what these people saw, but it wasn't swamp gas." He could have maintained his scientific integrity, but he stayed. He gave the explanation they demanded. He became the man who blamed UFOs on swamp gas. Why? In private correspondence years later, Hynek tried to explain his reasoning. He still believed he could do more good inside the system than outside it. He thought that by maintaining his position, he could continue documenting cases, building evidence, preparing for a time when the truth might emerge. He also feared what would happen if he spoke out, not just to his career, but to the phenomenon itself. He worried that if he, the chief scientific consultant to Blue Book, publicly stated that UFOs were real and represented unknown technology, the backlash would set serious research back decades. So he swallowed his pride, accepted the humiliation, and continued playing his role. But something inside him broke that day in Michigan. From that point forward, Hynek began quietly reaching out to other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He started building a network outside official channels. He began planning for a time when he would no longer be constrained by Air Force protocols. He also began speaking more carefully but more pointedly at academic conferences and in scholarly papers. He never explicitly contradicted Blue Book's conclusions, but he raised methodological concerns. He questioned whether the investigation was designed to find truth or provide reassurance. Those who understood what he was doing, other researchers, sympathetic colleagues, recognized that Hynek was laying groundwork, building a case, preparing to speak more openly when the time was right. Hynek contacts other scientists. In the late 1960s, as Project Blue Book began its slow decline toward closure, Hynek intensified his outreach to researchers outside the military system. He established correspondence with Jacques Vallée, a French-American computer scientist who was taking a more rigorous data-driven approach to UFO research. Vallée wasn't interested in sensationalism or speculation. He wanted patterns, statistical analysis, cross-cultural comparison. Hynek and Vallée exchanged hundreds of letters over the years. In those letters, carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, Hynek hinted at the frustrations of working within Blue Book. In a 1967 letter, Hynek wrote, "There are cases the Air Force will not let me classify as unexplained, though they clearly are. I receive reports that have been sanitized, edited, stripped of their most compelling details. It's like trying to study a phenomenon through a filter designed to make it invisible." Vallée later claimed that Hynek believed a hidden intelligence unit was operating within the Air Force, a group tasked with managing UFO incidents in ways that bypassed Blue Book entirely. This wasn't paranoia. Hynek had seen evidence of parallel investigations, cases referenced in internal memos that never appeared in official files, witnesses who mentioned talking to other Air Force investigators, who Hynek never met. Hynek also communicated with James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, who became one of the most vocal scientific critics of Project Blue Book. McDonald was everything Hynek couldn't be: bold, confrontational, willing to publicly challenge the Air Force's conclusions. He testified before Congress, accusing Blue Book of incompetence and deliberate obfuscation. He published papers arguing that UFOs represented a genuine scientific mystery deserving serious study. The Air Force hated McDonald. They viewed him as a threat. They worked behind the scenes to undermine his credibility, questioning his professional judgment, suggesting his UFO research was affecting his scientific work. Hynek admired McDonald's courage, but couldn't publicly align with him. Doing so would have ended his access to Blue Book and eliminated any influence he had on official investigations. Instead, Hynek supported McDonald privately. He shared data. He confirmed inconsistencies in official reports. He validated McDonald's criticisms while maintaining public neutrality. It was a delicate balance, staying inside the system while supporting those trying to expose its failures. Hynek also exchanged letters with Alan Sandage, one of the world's leading astronomers and Hynek's former colleague from Ohio State. Sandage was skeptical of UFOs but respected Hynek's integrity. In one letter, dated June 1968, Hynek wrote something remarkably candid. "Alan, I no longer believe we are dealing with misidentifications or psychological phenomena. After 20 years of reviewing these cases, I'm convinced something real is interacting with us. The question is not whether the phenomenon exists. It does. The question is, what is it? And why is the government so determined to prevent serious scientific study?" Sandage's response was cautious but supportive. He encouraged Hynek to document everything, to prepare for a time when he could speak more freely. He also warned Hynek to be careful, to avoid saying anything that might give his critics ammunition to destroy his reputation. Through these relationships, Hynek began building what would eventually become a post-Blue Book research network. He was preparing for the day when the official investigation ended and the real work could begin. Blue Book closes, but the questions remain. December 17, 1969. The Air Force officially shuts down Project Blue Book. The decision is based on the Condon Report, a study conducted by the University of Colorado and led by physicist Edward Condon. After 2 years of investigation, Condon concludes, "No evidence that UFOs represent extraterrestrial craft. No evidence that UFOs pose a threat to national security. No scientific value in continued study. The report recommends terminating Blue Book and discontinuing official UFO investigations." The Air Force is thrilled. They've wanted to exit the UFO business for years. The program is a public relations nightmare, a budget drain, a constant source of congressional questions. With Condon's academic blessing, they can finally shut it down. At a press conference, Air Force officials announced Blue Book's closure with barely concealed relief. The official statement is brief. "After 22 years of investigation, we have found no evidence that UFOs represent a threat, or that they are vehicles from other worlds. The matter is now considered closed." Hynek attends the press conference. He says nothing. Later, in interviews with mainstream media, he carefully endorses the closure. He tells reporters that most UFO cases can be explained, that the public's fears are unwarranted. The Air Force made a good faith effort to study the phenomenon. He plays his role one last time. But privately, to fellow researchers and in letters to trusted colleagues, Hynek says something very different. Blue Book was the storefront. The real research continued elsewhere. He explains his theory. The Air Force never stopped investigating UFOs. They simply stopped doing it publicly. The cases that really mattered, the ones involving military encounters, radar confirmations, physical evidence, were never part of Blue Book anyway. They were handled through compartmented programs with higher classification levels. Shutting down Blue Book wasn't about ending UFO research. It was about ending public scrutiny. Think about the logic. If UFOs were genuinely unimportant, why investigate them at all? But if they were genuinely important, if they represented unknown technology or potential threats, would you really conduct that investigation in a public program that published annual reports and answered congressional inquiries? Of course not. You'd create a public program that appeared to investigate while the real work happened in the shadows. Hynek believed Blue Book was always meant to fail. Its purpose was to absorb public attention and criticism while protecting the actual investigations from exposure. After Blue Book closed, Hynek was finally free to speak more openly. In 1973, he founded the Center for UFO Studies, creating an independent civilian database of sightings. He began giving lectures at universities, speaking more candidly about Blue Book's limitations and the cases that troubled him. He published a book, The UFO Experience, in which he developed a classification system for UFO encounters and argued that the phenomenon deserved serious scientific study. He was no longer the government's debunker. He was the phenomenon's most credible advocate, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the truth was far stranger and more complex than anyone publicly acknowledged. The missing Hynek files. When J. Allen Hynek died on April 27, 1986, researchers and archivists at the Center for UFO Studies immediately began the process of cataloguing his personal papers. They expected a treasure trove of documentation. Hynek had been meticulous about record-keeping throughout his career. They knew he maintained extensive personal files separate from his official work. Notes, correspondence, case analyses, witness interviews, classified memos he'd managed to copy before returning them. The archive would be invaluable. Decades of first-hand observations from the man who'd been inside Project Blue Book for 22 years. Evidence of the cases they'd never published. Proof of the filtering and manipulation he'd witnessed. What they found was incomplete. Several critical categories of material were missing entirely. His personal notes on the Lonnie Zamora case, gone. These weren't official Blue Book files. These were Hynek's private observations, his interviews with Zamora conducted years after the incident, his analysis of why the case remained unexplainable. He'd referenced these notes in correspondence as recently as 1985. His private Blue Book diary, gone. Hynek had kept a personal journal throughout the 1960s, documenting his daily experiences inside Blue Book. Not the sanitized official reports, but his real thoughts, his frustrations, his observations about how cases were manipulated. He'd shown portions of this diary to close colleagues. It was several hundred pages long, an entire folder labelled 1965 Northeast Radar Incidents. Gone. This folder contained documentation of multiple radar trackings of unknown objects over the northeastern United States during a concentrated period in 1965. These cases never made it into Blue Book's official reports. Hynek had been collecting data independently, building a case that the phenomenon was real and being deliberately ignored. His correspondence with Air Force intelligence officers between 1958 and 1964, gone. Hynek had maintained relationships with several intelligence officers who'd worked adjacent to Blue Book. Some of them had provided him with information about cases handled outside official channels. Their letters were candid, sometimes shockingly so, about the reality of what was happening. A box of witness interviews on audio cassette, gone. In the 1970s and early 80s, Hynek had revisited some of the most significant Blue Book cases, conducting new interviews with witnesses now willing to speak more freely. These recordings contained details that had never been made public. Hynek's family was adamant. The files had been in his office shortly before his death. His wife remembered seeing them when she'd helped him organise his study 3 weeks before he died. His son remembered his father mentioning the Lonnie Zamora notes, specifically in a conversation just days before the heart attack. But within a week of Hynek's death, between the funeral and when the archivists arrived to begin cataloguing, the files disappeared. The family filed inquiries. They contacted the Center for UFO Studies. They reached out to former colleagues, asking if Hynek had loaned materials to anyone. No one had taken the files, or if they had, they weren't admitting it. Mark Roediger, who became the scientific director of the Center for UFO Studies, later said, "It felt like someone had surgically removed the most sensitive material. Not everything, just the pieces that would have been most damaging if made public. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for." The official explanation was that Hynek had likely misplaced or destroyed the documents himself in his final years. Perhaps his health had been declining. Perhaps he'd been disorganized. But people who knew Hynek found that impossible to believe. Even in his 70s, he remained sharp, organized, obsessive about documentation. He'd spent 30 years building his archive. He'd talked about it as his legacy, the evidence he'd accumulated for future researchers. Why would he destroy it? And if he'd merely misplaced it, why specifically those files? Why not a random scattering of material? Why precisely the documents that contained the most sensitive information? The alternative explanation, that someone removed the files deliberately, raised darker questions. Who had access to Hynek's home in the days after his death? Who knew what was in his archive and which pieces were most damaging? Who had the motivation to ensure those specific documents never became public? Those questions remain unanswered, but the disappearance of the files became part of Hynek's story. One more suggestion that his suspicions about surveillance and suppression weren't paranoia. The hypothesis Hynek never published in the fragments that remained of Hynek's personal archive, researchers found hints of a theory he'd been developing in his final years, a hypothesis that went far beyond simple aliens from another planet. Based on his notes, private correspondence and conversations recalled by close colleagues, Hynek believed the UFO phenomenon was non-human in origin. Not human technology, not misidentification, not psychological phenomena. Something genuinely other. Technologically superior to anything humans had developed. The flight characteristics alone, instant acceleration, right-angle turns at high speeds, apparent disregard for inertia, suggested technology centuries or millennia ahead of us, intentionally masking itself. The phenomenon appeared in ways that made it difficult to study or prove. It avoided clear, unambiguous encounters. It left just enough evidence to suggest something real, while providing skeptics with plausible deniability. As if it wanted to be seen but not confirmed. Possibly interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. This was Hynek's most radical conclusion. He'd grown skeptical of the simple, visitors from another planet explanation. The objects didn't behave like scouts or explorers. They didn't follow patterns consistent with scientific observation or resource gathering. They appeared and disappeared in ways that seemed to violate physics, not because they broke physical laws, but because they were using those laws in ways we didn't yet comprehend. In a letter to Jacques Vallée dated November 1983, Hynek wrote, "I increasingly suspect we're dealing with something that exists in a relationship to our reality, that we don't have the conceptual framework to understand. These objects don't travel through space in the conventional sense. They don't seem to come from anywhere and go anywhere. They manifest, they appear, and then they're gone, as if our three-dimensional space is just one layer of a more complex structure." He elaborated on this in a 1985 paper presented to a small group of physicists and theorists. Physical laws are not violated. They are used in ways we do not yet grasp. What appears impossible, instantaneous acceleration, dematerialization, apparent defiance of gravity, may simply reflect our incomplete understanding of physics. Just as quantum mechanics revealed layers of reality invisible to classical physics, perhaps the UFO phenomenon operates in dimensions or states of being we haven't yet discovered. This was radical thinking. It suggested the phenomenon wasn't just advanced technology. It was something far more complex, possibly involving dimensions or realities beyond our current scientific framework. It also explained some of the pattern Hynek had observed over 3 decades. Why the phenomenon never provided clear, unambiguous proof of its existence. Why it seemed to adapt to human perception, appearing in ways that fit cultural expectations. Airships in the 1890s, rockets in the 1940s, sleek saucers in the 50s. Why witness accounts were often surreal, dreamlike, filled with absurd details that made them easy to dismiss, as if the phenomenon was operating in a space where the normal rules of physical reality were more fluid. Why scientific study seemed to make it recede, as if observation itself affected the phenomenon. Hynek never published this hypothesis. He discussed it only with close colleagues, and even then carefully. He knew how it would sound. He knew it would destroy whatever mainstream credibility he had left. The scientific community barely tolerated his advocacy for UFO research as potential extraterrestrial visitation. If he started talking about interdimensional phenomena and reality structures beyond our understanding, he'd be dismissed as a crank. So he kept it private, sharing only with those he trusted to understand the distinction between speculative theory and ungrounded fantasy. But in his final years, he became increasingly convinced this was the right direction. The phenomenon was real, but it was stranger than simple aliens from another planet. It was something that challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Hynek's final warning. In the weeks before his death, Hynek gave a series of informal talks to small groups of researchers, private gatherings, not publicised, attended by people who had been following the phenomenon for decades. One attendee, a physicist who'd known Hynek since the 1970s, later recounted a conversation that took place at a Chicago restaurant in March 1986, just weeks before Hynek's death. Hynek was reflective that night, almost melancholy. He talked about his years with Blue Book, the cases that still troubled him, the pattern of suppression he'd witnessed. Then he said something the physicist would never forget. The Air Force knew the truth far earlier than they will admit. I'm certain of it now. They had cases in the late 40s and early 50s that were absolutely clear. Multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, cases that couldn't be explained away, and they made a decision. The truth was too destabilizing to reveal. The physicist asked what he meant by destabilizing. Hynek explained, "If you tell people that non-human intelligence is interacting with us, that our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete, that the government has been lying for decades, what happens? Religious institutions face challenges to their cosmology. Scientific paradigms crumble. Public trust in government evaporates. Social stability depends on shared assumptions about reality. Pull one thread, and the entire fabric might unravel. They chose containment over disclosure." "Do you think that was the right choice?" someone asked. Hynek was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. Maybe they genuinely believed they were protecting people from information they weren't ready to handle. Maybe they were right to be cautious, but I think they underestimated humanity. I think people are more resilient than the gatekeepers give them credit for. And I think the cost of secrecy, the cost of allowing this phenomenon to remain unexamined by the full scope of human science, that cost might be higher than the risk of disclosure." Another researcher asked if Hynek thought disclosure would ever happen. "I used to think it would come gradually," Hynek replied. "Slow revelation, careful management. But I'm not sure anymore. The secrecy has gone on so long, the compartmentalization runs so deep, I'm not sure the people currently in charge even know the full picture. The information is scattered across agencies that don't communicate. The institutional memory is fragmented. We might have reached a point where the truth can't be disclosed because no one person or organisation has access to all of it." This was a chilling idea, that the cover-up had become so complex, so bureaucratically distributed, that it had transcended any individual or agency's control. The secrecy had become self-perpetuating, maintaining itself through sheer organisational inertia. Before they left the restaurant that night, Hynek said one more thing. "I've documented what I could. I've left a record. Maybe someday, when the time is right, someone will be able to piece together the full picture. All I can do is leave breadcrumbs and hope someone follows them." 5 weeks later, he was dead. Operation Sentinel. One of the most intriguing and unverified claims about Hynek's final years involves a program allegedly called Operation Sentinel. According to Jerome Davis, a researcher who claims to have spoken with Hynek at a conference in September 1985, Hynek mentioned a classified monitoring program that allegedly continued UFO surveillance after Blue Book ended. Davis's account, published years later in a UFO research journal, describes a conversation where Hynek seemed unusually candid, perhaps because he was among colleagues, perhaps because he was growing weary of maintaining secrecy. Hynek allegedly said, "Blue Book ended, but the work didn't. There's a program, I don't know what it's officially called, but I've heard it referred to as Sentinel. It's joint CIA and Air Force, with cooperation from NASA and possibly other agencies. It uses advanced surveillance technology that didn't exist when Blue Book was operating." He described what Sentinel allegedly involved: reconnaissance satellites specifically tasked with tracking objects entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. Not the general surveillance satellites everyone knows about, but specialized systems designed to detect unconventional propulsion signatures and anomalous trajectories. Radar triangulation networks across the continental United States, positioned to provide overlapping coverage and immediate notification when objects moving at unconventional speeds or exhibiting unusual flight characteristics are detected. International reporting systems coordinated with allied nations, Britain, Canada, Australia, potentially others. A data sharing network that allows for tracking of objects across national boundaries. Automated analysis systems using computer algorithms to filter reports and identify patterns, something that wasn't technologically feasible during Blue Book's operation, but became possible in the 70s and 80s. According to Davis, Hynek claimed he'd heard about Sentinel from a former intelligence officer who'd reached out to him in the late 1970s. The officer was dying of cancer and wanted to unburden himself before the end. They met at a hotel near O'Hare Airport. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The officer, Hynek never revealed his name, described an operation that had been running since the early 70s shortly after Blue Book's closure. Blue Book was a public relations operation, the officer allegedly told Hynek. Sentinel was the real program. We kept tracking, we kept analysing, we kept investigating. We just stopped telling anyone about it. When Hynek asked why the secrecy was maintained, the officer supposedly replied, "Because the phenomenon never stopped. The sightings continued, the radar trackings continued, and we still don't understand what we're dealing with. But admitting that publicly, after spending 20 years telling everyone there's nothing to worry about, that would be career suicide for everyone involved. There is no official record of Operation Sentinel. No documents have surfaced. No whistleblower has provided corroborating testimony. No budget lines in declassified Air Force spending show a program by that name. But the idea fits perfectly with the pattern Hynek had observed for decades, a public facade covering a secret reality. If Sentinel existed, it would explain several things. Why the Air Force was so comfortable shutting down Blue Book. They didn't need public legitimacy anymore. They could monitor the phenomenon privately, without congressional oversight or media scrutiny. Why credible sighting reports continued to come from military pilots and radar installations after 1969, but no official investigation was conducted. The investigation was happening, just not publicly. Why Hynek remained convinced that the government knew more than it was revealing? Because they did. The investigation never stopped. Some researchers dismiss the Sentinel story as unverifiable rumour. Others point out that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when dealing with classified programs. What's notable is that Hynek, a cautious, methodical scientist, found the story credible enough to mention it to colleagues. He wasn't prone to repeating unverified claims. If he talked about Sentinel, he believed there was something to it. Whether that program existed under that name or something like it existed under a different designation, the central claim seems almost certainly true. The United States government didn't stop investigating UFOs when Blue Book closed. They just stopped doing it in public view. Hynek's legacy. The man who tried to tell us softly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hynek began slipping information into public speeches and academic presentations. He'd give a talk about the history of Project Blue Book and then casually mention, there were cases involving objects tracked on radar that Blue Book never officially logged. The data exists, but it was classified at the time and remains so today. Or he'd discuss the methodology of UFO investigation and note, cases involving multiple military witnesses and physical evidence often bypassed Blue Book entirely. They were handled through different channels. I wasn't given access to them. Or he'd talk about the Lonnie Zamora incident and add, I wrote extensive analysis concluding this was a genuine unknown. That analysis was classified. The public version of my conclusions was simplified. He never made explicit accusations. He never named specific agencies or individuals. He never violated his security clearances or revealed classified information. But for those paying attention, researchers who understood the implications, the message was clear. The official story was incomplete. The truth was far more complex and far more troubling. Hynek was leaving a trail, building a case, providing future researchers with hints about where to look and what questions to ask. He also began mentoring younger researchers, passing on his knowledge and connections. He made sure that when he died, there would be people who understood what he'd learned and could continue asking questions. After his death, archivists at the Centre for UFO Studies discovered how extensive his network had become. He'd been corresponding with scientists, journalists, military personnel, and intelligence community members across the country and around the world. Many of these correspondents came forward after his death, sharing letters and notes Hynek had sent them. The picture that emerged was of a man conducting a careful, decades-long campaign to preserve evidence and build support for serious scientific study, all while navigating the constraints of his security clearances and professional reputation. One archivist at QFOS said there were files he could never show publicly, and they vanished the same week he died. But he'd been preparing for that possibility. He'd shared information with enough people, in enough different places, that the core of what he knew survived even if the physical documents didn't. The question was whether anyone would be able to piece together the fragments he'd left behind. The real story is in the cases they never let him touch. Researchers estimate that approximately 20% of Project Blue Book's data was never made public. This isn't speculation. It's based on comparisons between the number of cases Blue Book officially investigated, 12,618, references in internal military documents to cases that don't appear in Blue Book's published reports, testimony from military personnel who filed UFO reports that never showed up in the official archive, analysis of Blue Book's case numbering system, which shows gaps suggesting removed cases. These were the cases involving military pilots reporting structured craft with no visible propulsion during active flight operations, not training exercises where misidentification might be understandable, but combat-ready pilots on routine patrol who encountered objects that outmaneuvered their aircraft. Radar operators tracking objects accelerating from stationary hover to thousands of miles per hour in seconds. Not atmospheric anomalies or equipment glitches, but solid returns tracked across multiple systems, sometimes visually confirmed by pilots. Incidents near nuclear installations, missile silos and strategic air bases. Sightings that occurred over the most sensitive military facilities, suggesting intelligence rather than random encounters. Events with physical evidence, scorched earth, radiation readings above background levels, electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition and electronic systems, material samples that couldn't be identified, cases involving multiple categories of evidence simultaneously, visual sighting plus radar confirmation, plus physical effects, plus multiple witnesses. The cases where everything lined up and no conventional explanation fit. Hynek was systematically excluded from these cases. When he asked about them, he was told they involved national security. When he pressed for access, he was told the evidence was inconclusive or that the witnesses were unreliable. This despite some witnesses being highly trained military personnel with impeccable service records. He knew the pattern. The best evidence was always classified, always buried, always kept just out of reach. In his final interview with Rebecca Marks, Hynek said, "The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. That data still exists somewhere, locked in archives, hidden in compartmented programs, scattered across intelligence agencies that don't communicate with each other. Maybe it's in an Air Force vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Maybe it's in CIA archives, filed under counterintelligence rather than aerial phenomena. Maybe it's in the National Reconnaissance Office, mixed in with satellite surveillance data. Maybe it's distributed across multiple agencies, each holding pieces of a puzzle none of them can see completely. And maybe, just maybe, there are people inside those agencies who know the full truth. People who've seen the evidence Hynek never could. People who understand what's been interacting with us for decades. People who carry the same burden Hynek carried, knowing something that changes everything but being unable to speak. The question is, will they ever tell us? Or will the phenomenon remain what it's always been? Something we glimpse, something we document, something we can never quite prove. A reality that exists in the gap between what we can observe and what we can conclusively demonstrate. J. Allen Hynek spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He started as a debunker and ended as a believer. He worked for the government and was betrayed by it. He maintained his scientific reputation, while quietly building a case for the phenomenon's reality. He wanted to tell the truth but was trapped by classification, career pressures, and the knowledge that some truths destroy the people who speak them too directly. In the end, he did what he could. He left clues, he built networks, he spoke carefully but persistently. He documented everything he could, knowing that someday someone might be able to piece together what he'd learned. And then he died. 3 months after giving an interview that someone thought was dangerous enough to erase. The tape is gone, but the questions remain. What did Hynek really know? What was in those missing files? Who decided the public couldn't handle the truth? And most importantly, is the phenomenon still active? Are unknown objects still being tracked, investigated, documented in classified programs we'll never hear about? Maybe someday we'll find out. Maybe the truth will emerge gradually through freedom of information requests and whistleblower testimony. Maybe some future equivalent of Hynek will decide the time has come to speak openly. Consequences be damned. Or maybe, like so many things in this field, we'll be left with fragments, hints, and the growing suspicion that reality is far stranger than we've been allowed to believe. One thing is certain. J. Allen Hynek believed the phenomenon was real. After 3 decades of study, after seeing the evidence firsthand, after witnessing the suppression and manipulation, he was convinced. And if someone with his credentials, his experience, his access to classified data came to that conclusion, maybe the rest of us should pay attention. Because if he was right, if the government really has been hiding the truth for 70 years, then we're living in a reality fundamentally different from the one we've been told exists, and that changes everything. This is Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. Sleep well, and keep asking questions. Because somewhere, in a classified vault, in a forgotten archive, in the memory of aging intelligence officers who'll carry secrets to their graves, the truth is waiting. The truth J. Allen Hynek spent his life trying to reveal. The truth about what's been visiting us, watching us, studying us. The truth we're still not allowed to know, but someday, maybe we will. Someday.